focused ethics. Another is reasoned politics, and the most recent one is compassionate purpose. We've done an interview before, like a few years ago, and I think that was focused on his book on EA and the general suffering focus ethics vibe. But I recently did, or last year, I was part of a book club where we read suffering focus ethics, so it was really good to re-engage with the material. So welcome, Magnus. It's really good to have you back on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Adam.
Yes. Well, since we're going to be talking about suffering-focused ethics, maybe do you want to give us a 1,000-foot view of what the main purpose for the book was? What was what's the main purpose?
Right, so suffering-focused ethics we're talking about here, right? Yeah. So
Correct.
yeah, this was a book published back in 2020. Um,
Oh,
it's a book.
sorry, I got confused. I'm going to have to cut that bit.
Okay,
Audience,
no
we're actually
worries.
talking about compassionate purpose. Whoops, my
But we could
bad.
also start with suffering-focused ethics. It's also an okay
Yeah,
place to
yeah, yeah. I
start,
think
but
okay. So why don't you give us because there's a triad here: suffering, focus, ethics, reason, politics, and compassionate purpose. Maybe it's a good idea to describe why you wrote them in this sequence, or why they're a part of a triad.
yeah, and we can just try to cover the background very briefly. So, Suffering Focused Ethics indeed is the first of these three books published back in 2020. Um, it's a book in two parts, where the first part I tried to make a case for suffering focused ethics, like why the reduction of suffering deserves special priority, special moral priority. That is my argument, and there are various arguments one can draw on there, like from um, value theory and also moral asymmetries of various kinds that may support a focus on reducing suffering. And having made, I make sort of two different parallel arguments in some sense, because I both defend a fairly strong view, which is my own view, which is a moral view that gives overriding priority to the reduction of extreme suffering. So places that, as the highest priority that generally overrides other priorities. But in addition to that, the main aim of that moral case is just to establish a somewhat weaker claim, or a much weaker claim, which is that the reduction of suffering deserves special priority, even if we don't deem it like the overriding priority in every single case. So that's then that basic normative moral case for prioritizing suffering. And having made that, I then proceed in the second part of the book to explore the practical side of how can we actually reduce suffering. So obviously that's a big topic, but I try to explore different aspects of it, including not least the fact that we have a lot of uncertainty around it, which I think is an important thing to acknowledge as one of the first things, because that does it's present in just about every domain that we consider, and then also of course going on to explore the moral issues concerning non-human animals, and how we can reduce the suffering of other animals, and also proceeding to eventually discuss the topic of S risks, and which I believe you will also be speaking with my colleague Tobias Baumann about, namely risks of astronomical or future suffering. So I sort of try to broadly cover those practical issues, and indeed argue that the reduction of S risks also, in particular, deserves to be a significant priority. So I think that is pretty much suffering-focused ethics in a nutshell. What I try to do there. So it's sort of, that's the book that more or less serves as the moral foundation of the other two books. Because to then proceed, recent politics I published 2 years later, and that was that's actually also a book in different parts where it first has this more like there's a part that's more of a has a general scope where I argue for like a two-step approach to politics. One where first we try to clarify and argue for our values. So there's the values step. And then as a second step, we have what I call the empirical step, where given a certain set of values, we can then explore empirical evidence that can help us inform how to best realize those values or yeah, act in accordance with those values, which is more of an empirical question. So in that way, it's sort of also I think can help bring some clarity to political discussions, political thinking, to clarify what are values questions and what are more empirical questions, and thereby hopefully bring some clarity, ideally even some rigor to yeah our thinking about politics and to better discern where at what level, for example, that disagreements might be emerging. But that's then at the general level, I argue for taking that approach or moving more in a direction of that kind of approach in politics. And then there, I have also like a more a part of that book that is more applied, so to speak, where I adopt a sort of a broadly suffering focused view at the level of values and then proceed to explore empirical evidence. So going to this empirical step of trying to clarify so which policies actually seem best supported if we have a suffering focused view, and which is then that's actually most of that book delves into these well yeah these empirical details, one might call them, trying to dive into yeah exploring various lines of evidence to see okay which policies seem to make sense, which again going back to what I mentioned earlier, like there's a lot of uncertainty, it's very complicated, but I still think that it can nevertheless be helpful to yeah try to be informed by empirical evidence and yeah try to could you say like pursue practical directions based on yeah the available evidence. And so that's pretty much recent politics in a nutshell, trying to sort of resting on that foundation of suffering focused ethics and exploring specifically like the political and institutional level, which is after all very consequential. And having yeah like so then compassionate purpose, my most recent book just published last week in
Mm.
fact,
Mhm.
tries to do something fairly similar, but instead of focusing on the political and institutional level, it then focuses on yeah directly on the personal level. Again, having this background of yeah, I take as my starting point a, a suffering focused view, an aim of trying to reduce suffering. In particular, I do place a strong emphasis on the reduction of extreme suffering again. And then I try to explore various lines of evidence as to how can we best live our personal lives, broadly construed, to reduce suffering, and that includes managing like handling the various challenges that come up, difficulties such as, for example, feeling overwhelmed by the suffering around us, such as the social challenges that can also emerge when we, for example, might feel isolated or might feel like we can find it difficult perhaps to find common ground with other people sometimes.
Mm.
And yeah, that there can be various challenges of that kind, but I would also say that the book is not only about managing these challenges in the sense of just getting our head above the surface, but it's also about how we can even, yeah, I would go further and say develop moral excellence in order to
Mhm.
become more capable agents to reduce suffering. So in that way,
Mm.
it also has like a further level of ambition and not merely being able to stand our ground and be resilient, but actually be effective agents for change. And yeah, I hope
Oh,
that we can dive more deeper into
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. Yes. Yeah. So, look, I really enjoyed reading it. Well, I actually listened to the audio for some of it, but I went through it twice.
Oh,
There's a lot of really cool stuff in there, and I really enjoyed it. Now, I've been going through a self-help phase again in my life. I've done it before, but yes, you know, reading a lot of psychology, seeing a psychologist. So I found a lot of this stuff really very useful, and you know, hitting a lot of home runs for me. I thought that it can really it can really help people achieve that kind of you know, the kind of well-being, the Goldilocks zone of well-being and altruism, maybe you could call it. But I mean, it does sit in a bit of an unusual pace, does it? The part self-help and part moral philosophy that leans into suffering-focused ethics, and part a practical guide of how not to burn out when facing the horrors of the world, and a lot of the self-help out there says find your purpose, but your view seems to be more demanding in a sense. Purpose should be answerable to what actually matters ethically, not merely what feels meaningful. So, yeah, I'll pass the baton back to you and say, what kind of gap were you trying to fill?
yeah, exactly. So that was in fact something that I myself at least have often thought and felt, and I suspect many others have as well, namely that a lot of self-help, it tends to be aimed at just about like any purpose of one's choice, or and often quite like maybe narrowly self-serving ends, which I think there can be a place for that, but I also think that it does make sense, a lot of sense, I think, to actually yeah, to combine it with like more of an ethical purpose, an explicitly
Mm,
ethical purpose, and I think actually it's not just that I would call this, so to speak, a failure or a neglect of the self-help genre, because I think actually conversely, I think it's also a gap in the ethical literature or genre, right? That it's kind of obvious in some sense that if we are trying to face, yeah, difficult moral realities, that we might need some help and some guidance in that respect, not just in like abstract third person terms, but also something that is more, yeah, personal, something that like comes kind of close, and also is willing to be very practical at a low level, and including at the level of emotions and everyday daily life challenges, right? Like the challenges of willpower and so on, right? That of course plays does actually play quite a large role, right? Because it's fine to talk about integrity, but then one also needs some tools to actually to live it, right, or make it
mm,
more livable, more realistic, more practical. So yeah, that was very much, and so of course in some sense the book also grew out of my own maybe personal need for actually having some of these tools, right? And perhaps it's even especially important and needed when one has maybe a suffering focused view, right? Because suffering can be especially challenging. I don't know, compared to say just having a focus on virtues or the like in general. Suffering is a very like horrific phenomenon, right? In its worst instances, and that can really be, yeah, as I think you said, quite demanding, and
mm.
may thereby, I mean, require that we call for like a stronger psychological toolbox in some sense.
Yes. Look, the book you wrote has got a strong practical term, but you know, it's got a you know, rest on the substantial ethical view. So, how much of the book do you think depends on accepting suffering-focused ethics, and how much of it can be useful for people who don't necessarily agree with the overriding importance of suffering? Do you think people like I said? I don't agree that suffering is ultimately completely overriding. But I still got a lot from this book. Now, yeah, from my personal point of view, that's the case. But did you write it for this purpose, for anybody who has at least some degree of interest in suffering reduction, even if it's not like, you know, the hardline negative utilitarian suffering, the requirement of suffering must override, sorry, the reduction of suffering must override all other ethical responsibilities.
Yeah, yeah. So I have a note fairly early in the book saying that like uh, we can adopt in the first place this purpose of reducing suffering to the extent we find it plausible, and we
Mm.
can follow the suggestions I present in the book to the extent we find them reasonable. And I think that was quite a deliberate framing, because obviously I would also want to be very inclusive. Like realistically, we're not all going to agree, and also thankfully, it's not like we have to agree fully on some particular suffering-focused views. I mean, or yeah, even proponents of suffering-focused ethics don't necessarily agree on the details. But this
Mm.
is partly the whole point of yeah of suffering-focused ethics, and even more broadly, having a pragmatic approach, namely trying to be to focus on building a very broad coalition to reduce suffering. And yeah, we don't have to all agree on the details of our moral views in order to still agree that suffering obviously matters, and
Mm.
it's worth reducing it when we can, and there aren't substantial or greater costs associated with it. So and as for so I suspect different parts of the book. Um, so there is one chapter, for example, chapter 6, which is very specific, I would say, quite directly targeted at those who are aiming to reduce extreme suffering and who struggle with that with that aim and difficulties associated with it. And it's even titled "Reducing Extreme Suffering in Healthy Ways." But
Mm.
then there are also chapters that are much more general in scope, such as like the previous one, facing adversity in healthy ways, which can be like just any kind of adversity. So yeah, in that way, like different parts of the book are more or less general, I would say. Like they sort of vary in that way, but most of it is, I would think, quite should be generally useful, I think. And also also applicable if one has, say, other altruistic aims that give different weight to suffering than I do.
Was there a personal reason why you wanted to write this book roundabout now? Was there some sort of thing? Yeah, was there a personal event or something like that that you know that's okay to divulge? If yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
that's a good question. I actually, let's see. So not, I wouldn't say any personal reasons, like just beyond the fact that these the issues that I tackle in the book have been live issues in my own life. um, and then also just the fact, no, I think it was actually more driven by considerations around where there seemed to be most of a gap, when with respect to suffering focused ethics. So for example, general arguments about the moral philosophy aspect already existed, and for example also books on the political and institutional side. But this personal aspect did seem quite neglected, and especially considering its importance. So yeah, those were some of like the main reasons I wrote it.
If someone came away from the book having changed only one thing in their life, what would you hope that change might be?
Wow, yeah, that's a difficult question. I mean, I guess it also depends on like the starting point. So one thing I would say is, for example, it's of course also difficult to say what would amount to a singular change. But I did write the book. I did have people in mind who struggle a lot with the reality of suffering, and being able to face that in healthy ways. So one thing I would hope for a change would be people coming away from the book with more of a sense of having the ability to actually face these challenges, right? So a shift maybe from hopelessness to hopefulness, and having a sense of resilience and competence in the face of these real challenges. I don't know if that's like a single change. Maybe at the end of the day, that's actually ultimately many different tools. But like as a broad shift in mindset, that's very much something I hope to achieve. And I would actually then broaden that point, right? Because that can also apply to someone who doesn't necessarily struggle in like a deep emotional way, but might be unsure how to yeah, take any concrete steps to reduce suffering. And I would also very much hope that people can find like motivation and concrete ideas, yeah, to put into to practice.
Right, yes. So let's talk about this ethical foundation of why focus on extreme suffering. The book uses quite extreme or vivid examples like torture, burning alive, being eaten alive, and unbearable pain. Do you think, or why do you think we need to keep such examples in view rather than speaking only in abstractions?
Yeah, that's it's actually very interesting that you mentioned that, because I think it was maybe well, with the exception of a later chapter that titled "Facing Unpleasant Conclusions." In the opening of the book, I actually tried to keep it fairly
Mm,
abstract. I think I have maybe like one sentence where I do briefly mention these kinds of uh, yeah, examples, which I think are generally still fairly. I mean, one could obviously describe them much more vividly still, but yeah, then the reason, and I actually had some feedback to the effect of maybe trying to be more specific. But I tried to lean towards the speaking in more general terms to not make it too overwhelming. I did want this book to be a bit more, to be much more safe compared to, for example, suffering focused ethics, which does go, yeah, much deeper into descriptions of cases of suffering. But yeah, so nevertheless, I did mention these examples, and I think that's basically just to give a better sense of what I'm actually talking about when I say extreme suffering. So as a matter of definitional clarity, actually, to say, so what do you mean by extreme suffering? And these are, yeah, some of the, like, I don't know, basic examples. Basic doesn't feel like the right term, but yeah, maybe some examples that are sort of relatively understandable as something that's yeah, horrific and has a lot of significance.
mm,
And I do think that it's actually interesting as a psychological matter, right? That extreme suffering, it can be so yeah, so challenging and overwhelming if we allow it to get in. I mean, and at least I think, yeah, many of us can be quite it can give us real pause, and maybe even, I mean, I know some people have even become traumatized
mm.
by being exposed to certain cases of suffering, such as in the form of video clips. And so, and I think we probably have fairly strong psychological defenses, where it's very easy for us to keep suffering very abstract, like extreme suffering. And so I think we are quite happy to keep it at a distance, and not really to, yeah, to go to really elaborate, or have very clear, vivid associations, or yeah, uh, connected with extreme suffering. So for that reason, I think it's sometimes it is helpful to somewhat, if not break those defenses, but at least poke them a little bit, challenge a little bit, so we at least have some sense of what we're actually talking about, which is actually a relevant point, right? That many people who have undergone extreme suffering or very severe suffering, they describe it in terms of it being ineffable. It just can't be conveyed how bad and severe it actually is. So, for example, people who have undergone torture have yeah, described it in those terms. So, as a kind of weight and gravity there that I think yeah, like conveying that to a greater extent can sometimes be helpful, even as I did
Yeah,
quite try
yeah.
to yeah protect the reader.
Yeah, I think it's useful to, in context, invoke the reality of the situation, the reality of what happens in the real world, so that people can get a sense of the gravity of it all. Though a critic might say that extreme suffering feels overriding when we look at it closely, but many things feel overriding when we focus on them. Does this not prove but they might argue that this doesn't prove lexical or near lexical priority. Now, how would you respond to that general critical sort of approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like a larger discussion, right, about moral ethics, where
Yeah.
I think there's probably not like one line of argument. I think
Mm.
ideally we will want to explore that from many different angles, and
Mm.
ultimately, yeah, ideally want to triangulate our way to like, okay, what's the most plausible view, all things
Sure.
considered, considering
Mm.
also all the various kinds of biases we might have, and also arguments from yeah that take like rather different approaches. So for example, that there are also arguments that would like when also arguments that can favor suffering focused ethics that for example would focus on other purported sources of value and um, make the case yeah like various arguments as to why let's say pleasure is not as valuable as we tend to think, right? So I myself have um, made some arguments to this effect, like for example that arguing that and of course that's is an argument that rests on introspection. But my argument is that if we carefully introspect and try to observe pleasure itself, I argue that there is nothing inherently about pleasure that suggests that it is the moral opposite of suffering or that it outweighs suffering. And even some also go further and argue that pleasure. So, for example, people like Roger Thistel and also Simon Knudsen arguing that pleasure is really essentially the absence of various disturbances that usually are below the surface or that we don't notice them so clearly. But pleasure, the or at least what makes pleasure feel better, is essentially the reduction of other like bothersome features
Mm.
of consciousness, which can be quite significant, they would argue, even if we don't tend to notice them as such, simply because they are so common. So, but anyways, that's another like relevant line of argument that can also help like inform our all things considered view. And obviously there are a lot of arguments one can make back and forth on these issues. So it clearly gets or quickly gets quite technical, and I would agree that one should not base one's moral views solely on some kind of yeah like immediate sense or impression that one can have of a given state, even if it might be a relevant input.
Hmm. Yes. So one of the things that I brought up in the reading group that we had for suffering focused ethics was the asymmetry argument seems to partly be grounded in the hedonic range familiar to us as humans. So extreme suffering appears far more urgent and morally weighty than ordinary pleasure, but that could be an artifact of our evolutionary design, and arguably evolution has strong reasons to make pain and terror extremely intense, since avoiding death is urgent, right? While it may only have needed ordinary pleasures, mild pleasures, to motivate reproduction and social behaviour. So if future minds, let's say, post-human AI qualia designers could explore vastly richer forms of enjoyment than evolution made available to us, might that be an argument to have to reevaluate the asymmetry, the hard asymmetry between suffering and pleasure?
Yeah, so that's an argument that's been made and in fact also discussed quite a bit. I've actually also written an essay about it myself. So one thing to notice, I think, is that, or like one point that could be made in response to it, it obviously depends on where one stands on these value questions and moral questions, right? Because, so for example, I think this argument will be especially compelling to someone who actually does accept some kind of moral symmetry, but they might think just that, yeah, in our current minds, there is de facto a kind of maybe empirical asymmetry, where just our suffering tends to be much more intense than our pleasure, and therefore, yeah, I mean, and this then this argument about what one could call, it's a bit of an evolutionary contingency, right? That we happen to be in this way. Um, that the argument kind of works because it preserves an underlying already accepted version of a moral underlying moral symmetry, even if it's asymmetric in our case. But the argument has much less force if we don't really buy that there is such a moral symmetry in the first place. If, for example, we don't really accept that, and this again is can get a little bit technical, because, so for example, one can hold that suffering has, or sorry, that pleasure has some kind of positive value, but one can hold also that nevertheless it's a kind of positive value that is always overwritten by suffering in terms of, for example, and there again, one can hold that either in terms of value or in terms of moral importance, in particular. And if one holds that kind of view, then the intensity of pleasure doesn't necessarily change so much, because one may still hold that it still lacks moral importance, even if one makes it more intense. It still doesn't get to a point where it's something that is morally important to create, or that its absence is a problem, which is something that, yeah, like an asymmetry that many would stress, that being in extreme suffering compared to an untroubled state is a serious, severe problem, obviously. Whereas being in a state of a completely untroubled state where there's nothing that's bothersome whatsoever, rather than a state of intense pleasure, arguably isn't a problem, or at least not a moral problem that's urgent to address. And so that kind of asymmetry in, yeah, in the urgency of creating a change is at least what some would see as grounding a moral asymmetry in our priorities. And the intensity of pleasure itself, yeah, doesn't fundamentally change that, because we still have that basic asymmetry at the core, some would argue, and I myself, I agree with that line of argument.
Yeah. So, I guess, yeah, I certainly prioritize suffering reduction in my scheme, although I don't have the overriding I don't buy into the overriding obligation. But, the empirical aspects of what we know about suffering and is very much informed by our feeling of it. And so, but the grounds might shift if we had a better view of what the ground actually looks like and what it really is. And I for my view, I'd like my meta ethics to be sort of responsive to that, I would say. So, but you, on this subject of meta ethics, your book makes strong narrative claims about the priority of extreme suffering. So, but it's not primarily a meta ethics book. But what is your meta-ethical view, if I might ask? How much
Yeah.
does compassionate purpose depend on it? For example, could a moral realist, a constructivist, an expressivist, an anti-realist, and all these different meta-ethical frameworks accept most of the book's practical framework? Or there's some meta-ethical views that might be in real tension with it?
Yeah, so I would say that I don't think it rests on any particular view of meta ethics at all. So I think one can be, I mean, yeah, admittedly, sometimes I've struggled to understand some aspects of moral anti-realism, but basically, I think one can really hold virtually any meta-ethical view as long as one just accepts like or has this goal of reducing suffering or even trying to benefit others. I think that it can still much of the book will still apply. I don't see anything that actually rests on more moral realism in the book. And so when it comes to meta ethics, I actually haven't really touched on that since my book Suffering Focused Ethics. It hasn't really been a main priority, partly because I've noticed that people can often agree on normative ethics and on practical priorities,
Mm,
even while disagreeing strongly on meta ethics. So it's I guess something I've pretty much moved on from
mm,
effectively. Even though I mean that's not to claim that it's unimportant, but it's just it seems to me that some various other issues seem more urgent.
mm,
But my as for my own view, um, I find that moral terminology probably doesn't really carve nature at its joints. I'm not sure our moral terminology, whether we are always even clear ourselves, whether we know quite what our claims are, what claims we're making. And so maybe the first step in in discussing meta ethics is to try to clarify even what we mean by these various terms and what we
mhm,
don't mean. In my own case, I do find some version of moral realism to be plausible, but it when I say that, I don't necessarily endorse what one might interpret that to mean. So, for example, I mean, so because my own view is basically it does rest on how to put it, like the what I would call like the intrinsic disvalue of certain experiences, um, and I do think that those experiences themselves do give us like genuine reasons to prevent their existence, not according to something outside of those experiences, but actually by by their own lights, so to speak, or our own our own felt state. And then of course that's a further move that I would then make is then to say that and perhaps it gets a little bit technical, but then as a matter of personal identity, if we don't accept like a strong distinction between self and other, then this basic observation of the value of experience, or particularly the disvalue of certain experiences, it arguably just generalizes to all beings, all instances of consciousness. And then of course I said that it gives us a genuine reason. Then of course one can then debate, do we want to call that a moral reason or not, which of course also then raises the question of, well, what do we mean by moral? And perhaps there's some hair splitting there, I don't know, like depending on how we define it, I might say it is a moral reason or that it's not a moral reason. I mean, when we talk about right or wrong, I mean, so it's common to distinguish between like in value theory, talk about better and worse, and then in ethics, to also talk about right and wrong. And of course, the connection between those is uh, strongly debated, right? So, for example, consequentialists would generally uh, see a very direct connection, almost like a one-to-one connection between better and worse and right and wrong. And non-consequentialists would disagree with that, generally speaking. Um, and I don't know if I would necessarily, uh, I might not be so eager to insist on calling my view moral realism if someone would insist on instead calling it more like value realism without
Mm.
introducing moral talk. I might be fine with that, although perhaps, and yeah, that's then maybe it's kind of a matter of convention. What do we attach these words right and wrong to? Arguably, like in our culture, how we use these, it seems sort of tied to norms and what we can expect to maybe be rewarded or punished for. Um, so in that sense, it's not like I believe that there's some kind of what could you say norm that is that something is right or wrong relative to some norm that is goes beyond our experiences, right? It's just a matter of experience itself and what sentient beings themselves would consider, say, better or worse or right or wrong in their in terms of how what their experiences are like. So, but yeah, like maybe it does become ultimately a bit semantic, but a reason I would um, maybe at the end of the day want to hold on to a term like realism is that well, I don't think this talk about the value of experiences is at all arbitrary or, and I would hesitate also to call it anti-realist, because I do think it's genuinely real, and I do think the reasons that they give us, right, as is undeniable when we ourselves are experiencing, say, intense pain, right, that there is a genuine reason there that yeah, really cannot be denied in the moment we're having it, and I think cannot and shouldn't be denied either when it's happening in other beings, that it has that same uh, yeah, significance and importance. So yeah, I guess maybe that's like the best sort of imperfect way
Mm.
I can put it
I
in my view.
agree. I do consider myself a moral realist, but I also agree with your point about value realism, in that I think there's quite a lot of overlap between what one could consider moral, like, moral value, and what one could consider an epistemic value. Um, like the way in which I come to moral arguments is through grounding and then reasoning about that grounding. And the grounding is, I think, as David Pearce likes to say, the experience discloses the nature of the physical, right? In that you don't need like an argument, or somebody, who's got a doctor of philosophy to say that the experience of suffering or agony is bad. Animals who experience suffering and agony uniformly, like, show an adversity to noxious stimuli. So I think there's plenty of grounding out there. I think there's a lot of scientific backing to this idea. There's a lady, Sharon Hewitt Rowlett, who wrote a book on this particular thing, The Feeling of Value. I'd love to interview her sometime. I don't know if you've ever spoken to her or you had a chance to talk to her about it, but she's got a really interesting view on these sorts of things, at least on this particular point. I'm not sure about her other stuff, but
Yeah,
this particular point's pretty. Mm.
I actually I actually read much of her thesis in which she
Mm.
defends this her view. So, and it's true that meta ethically it's very similar to my own view and David Pierce's view.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
or
Well, I've got a
but
lot
she
of influence
then
in my philosophy from David Pearce, no doubt.
Oh yeah, yeah,
As you can
yeah, yeah.
imagine,
Me
yeah.
too. Me too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was quite a momentous discovery for me actually. When I found David's work, I was surprised, in fact, that I hadn't found it earlier. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I encountered him back in 2013. So
Mm-hmm.
huge inspiration for me. Actually, my view becoming suffering focused was very much, or at least much more strongly so, which very much inspired by David. Um, when I first encountered his negative utilitarian view, I didn't agree with it, but it gave me a lot to reflect on, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
But so yeah, I'm familiar with that, and that is yeah, it is this meta-ethical view that in some sense it's very much, almost one could frame it as being empirically based, being based on like very direct experience,
Mm-hmm.
and what, to use that term, like what experience discloses, arguably even. And I do find that, what can I say, at the end of the day, quite plausible. And I suppose many people, even if they don't agree on the meta-ethical side, they would still strongly agree, obviously, that so for example, if one is a moral anti-realist who prioritizes the reduction of suffering, presumably, yeah, the experience itself does play a very large role in informing that view, right? Even if one then, I don't know, frames it in very different terms metaethically, it's still really that the experience has, yeah, some significance, and points us in a certain direction of, yeah, prioritizing it and considering it, yeah, significant.
You invoke the golden rule. If we were in unbearable suffering, we would urgently want help. But let's just say we talk about the golden rule. Does it become unstable when applied across different types of minds with different psychologies? For example, non-human animals, digital minds, or possible alien minds. I know, I think I agree that suffering is suffering, and it doesn't matter what kind of animal or species it experiences it. But some people might argue that the same pattern of experience in a different mind could produce bliss, right? But yeah, I'm kind of skeptical about that, very skeptical about that. But yeah, I was just wondering what your thoughts were.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, that's a very interesting question, right? Because there are these complications where clearly, yeah, different kinds of beings can have very different kinds of preferences, right?
Mm.
And it can be very difficult to say, yeah, what others might experience, or even what others might want. um, so yeah, I mean, I grant that's a real complication, although as you were saying, when it comes to suffering itself, I mean, it seems like by its very nature, I mean, if one is in a state of suffering and one wants to experience it, then arguably it isn't really severe suffering. That one could argue that it is a kind of a component of suffering, that there is that, yeah, not wanting it, right? It is almost intrinsically a state of, I don't know, dispreferring, or yeah, of the aversion is, yeah, part of the nature of what suffering is. So, but I think that's something that also maybe contributes to the robustness of prioritizing suffering, right? That it is something that beings can, or yeah, we can generally agree on. As you say, even when it comes to non-human animals, it's pretty safe to say that they don't want to suffer, even while it can be difficult to, yeah, to know exactly what their preferences might be in other respects. But I mean, of course, it's, yeah, it's then, I think it's fair to acknowledge that there are a lot of things that we don't know about what minds can be like. Obviously, the space of possible experiences is just vast beyond really what we can realistically comprehend, which I suppose also applies to preferences. but yeah, nevertheless, I do think that we can actually have some that we're justified in having some degree of confidence when it comes to suffering, given its
Mm.
uh,
Yeah, I
intrinsic
tend to
badness,
agree.
I would argue.
I've got a question, but it does come a bit later in my list, and that's about if we take this, if we take the idea that there's some ground, there's some like landscape of value out there, there's something real about how the universe works that affords agents within it the ability to suffer or feel joy based on the structure of the universe, and what it can what the structure can actually instantiate. So, but yeah, and that would lean into the idea that if there is real structure out there underneath everything, then AI might be able to, if it's smart and wise and can I say it has the right instrumentation, be able to discover it. But let's put a pin in that for the moment and see how far we can get with the rest of the questions.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so you use the idea of cultivating traits and virtues that support compassionate impact. But why not just simply tell people to calculate expected impact directly? So we're on to
Yeah,
the
yeah.
the self-help meets impartial ethics section now.
Yeah, yeah. This is specifically chapter 9. That's about, yeah, virtues for compassionate impact. Or even much of the book actually has this focus on developing traits. Yeah, I review like various arguments that support this kind of focus, right? And they're quite diverse in nature. So one is just that there's this literature on bounded rationality, right, where it's been found that often we simply do better by
Mhm.
following relatively simple rules or virtues as compared to trying to make elaborate calculations that can end up being effectively garbage in, garbage out because it's just too complicated. We don't have enough information. So yeah, and also we can be much more generally be more predictable actually by following relatively simple rules. So that can also lead to like collective equilibria that are more stable, more dependable. And in addition, there's also the fact that I mean there's also a basic opportunity cost argument where doing elaborate calculations will tend to require a lot of resources, a lot of time, and so often it's better to simply make a quick decision and move on, and perhaps yeah move on to something that is more important, that perhaps more deserves that we calculate. Which, to be clear, I don't say we should never do, but just arguably not most of the time. That it makes sense that we mostly rely on relatively yeah simple rules of thumb and virtues. In addition, there is also an argument that it can be more motivating because trying to calculate can be very difficult. It can just be very demanding, also psychologically, when you can doubt, second guess just about every choice and what to do moment to moment, compared to simply yeah relying on more symbol, more habitual virtues that are, well, in one sense, one might think of virtues as being quite demanding because it's sort of upright and it's following like yeah, a virtuous path. But even if it might, in some sense, be demanding, it might nevertheless be less demanding than trying to do a lot of case by case calculations moment to moment. So yeah, so that's I think actually sometimes a bit of an underappreciated argument in favor of taking a more like virtue based approach to creating better outcomes. Yeah, I think those are some of the main reasons. Oh yeah, there are also considerations around what how our actions impact our own future actions and also the actions of people around us, namely that there is some evidence that, for example, if we cheat and lie, we can make ourselves more prone to lying and cheating in the future. So that's like a kind of, you could say, externality on ourselves that we should arguably consider when we might be, if we are tempted to behave poorly. That's, yeah, it's a further reason to have higher standards and to, yeah, embody virtues more.
Yeah, like I remember reading Josh Green's book Moral Tribes, and it was described as such. You know, you've got your it was, I think it was tied a lot in with system one and two thinking. But yeah, the virtue side of things was very much system one thinking, where you could just quickly execute a virtue because you'd already embodied and ingrained that in your being. But you could take the utilitarian way of thinking approach to ethics whenever there was a hard problem that you're focusing on. It's kind of like the difference between using automatic mode and manual mode in taking photography. When you're taking a shot, you don't,
Right.
you know, if
Yeah.
you want to take quick photos, you don't want to always frame it up absolutely perfectly. You know, you just want to take a photo, right? But if there's
Yeah.
need for a particular shot, you want to get a perfect lighting, you want to get the right sort of depth of field, you want to, you know, get the right sort of frame it up all properly. Maybe you do need to use your manual settings a bit more. Mm.
Yeah, and I think a good example of that can be like, so for example, when it comes to considerations around which career to pursue,
Mm.
right? That's like a major decision where it makes a lot of sense to, I mean, we can use the word calculate, but also just put the considerations on the table, and yeah,
Yeah.
in a very broad sense of the term, try to calculate what makes sense. Or likewise, at a slightly smaller scale, like which particular project to pursue is also like the kind of decision that makes a lot of sense, right? If one is going to invest weeks or months or even years into a given project, it makes sense that we, yeah, consider that carefully, that that's not just a quick heuristic decision.
Hmm. Use the language golden range rather than maximization. Why do you think this is important? And look, this leans into this issue I had, like with some of the early discussions around effective altruism, around being greedy to do the most good. This it was a mantra that
Right.
was floating about, and it kind of grated on me. In a sense, it was kind of like maybe causing some of the, you know, the Molochian dynamics to run wild in EA causes. And that, like, although wasn't familiar with Scott Alexander's meditations on Moloch back then, I don't know if he had even written it by then, but yes, this was one of the things that people were saying. So yeah, I've got an aversity to maximization behavior, uh, but yeah, do you want to talk about this golden range principle that you bring up?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's also something that is a fairly recurrent theme in the book. And so actually, in general, I do have this focus, and of course, that's something that really appears in so many domains. And there's even also a psychological paper on this from back in 2011, Adam Grant and Barry Schwartz, about this inverted U curve that appears again and again in psychology, but indeed also, for example, when it comes to like, say, optimal sleep or like optimal nutrition, right? For just about any nutrient, um, any vitamin or mineral, we can have either too little or too much of it, right? And I think that's really something that's a helpful general framework to have actually when we try to, when we think of, if not optimizing, then at least improving our traits. And so that's sort of like the background, so to speak, for this golden range, is that we have this inverted U curve of something that where we can do better or worse, and we can both undershoot and overshoot. And a reason to prioritize the golden range, in fact, there are a couple of them, right? One is just that since the curve often has this shape of sort of coming up and then bending and going down, it often isn't particularly consequential where exactly we lie on this high end of it, right? As long as we're like relatively close, it might actually be a waste of resources to try to be at the exact optimum, right? Given, for example, the opportunity costs of over optimizing a particular trait. And so And relatedly, I think it's often actually psychologically counterproductive to be. It's like a recipe for perfectionism to try to think of optimization in terms of a particular point, right? Which is a very narrow target after all, right? Infinitely small, in fact, right? If we are to be mathematically precise, but much better to think in terms of a range because it's more forgiving, obviously. If we think in terms of a point, we're almost guaranteed to fail. Whereas if we think in terms of a range, there's actually it's realistic that we can that we can actually maximize. And then likewise, I think it's actually it's kind of maybe a meta point, but a relevant one that's very has quite general relevance because I think it applies to many of us who have this kind of mindset, namely that even when it comes to optimization or maximization itself, that's also something where we can actually overshoot, right, and thereby become less effective in terms of real world effectiveness,
Mm.
because it can ultimately become obsessive, and we can overinvest in particular forms of optimization when we should in fact just yeah if we reduced it a bit, we could be more relaxed about certain things and focus on things that are like more consequential. So also when it comes to optimization itself, it makes sense, I think, to aim more for like a golden range of where we don't overdo it, which I think can be a common failure mode, right? As to give like maybe a specific example, could be someone who almost like every 10 seconds thinks about, okay, how to optimize here, how to optimize more and better. It relates to this approach of having more of a yeah virtue based approach rather than case by case calculation, because that calculating approach, I think it is actually a case of overshooting it, the optimum of when to calculate. So maybe we calculate too much sometimes
Mm.
among people with an effective altruist mindset.
Yeah, so I guess that, we can oversleep, or we can overwork, and as a result of overworking, we can sleep badly. We might neglect exercise in order to, try and optimize something, and thereby indirectly become less effective. And then, and some people like go through this analysis paralysis. I'm very guilty of doing that. Like I might analyze things for so long, try and optimize myself for the time when I'm actually going to act, and then I don't do anything. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. In my own life, I can see examples of these sorts of things. Do you think this is? Like, have you seen examples in the general sort of rationalist or EA community of this kind of behavior?
Maybe, yeah, in broad terms, I would say like sometimes there might be cases of maybe relatively small questions that can then maybe take up a lot of space, like just, and they're not necessarily small in absolute terms, but just when in relative terms, when compared to maybe more important questions, yeah, I think it can be easy to, I mean, maybe many of us just have, perhaps somewhat obsessive minds, right? And it's a bit like if you then give a mind a certain problem, it can be easy to then, okay, let me focus on this problem
Mm.
without having the wherewithal to step back and ask, okay, is this the problem to obsess about necessarily, right? And I think
Mm.
that's actually really, really helpful to be able to ask that kind of question. Maybe sometimes we just pursue some kind of problem solving without first asking whether it's quite the right problem to try to solve.
Hmm. Well, some people might worry that working on oneself becomes self-indulgent when others are suffering severely, right? So I'm trying to work on myself to become healthy of body and mind, whereas I could be, working in the soup kitchen right now, or I could be trying to work extra hard to make those extra dollars to donate to starving people in Africa. But your answer seems to be that self-care is part of the impact infrastructure. So yeah, what does that look like in practice?
Right. Yeah, first of all, I just want to assure you, Adam, this is a very high impact right now, what you're doing. So this,
Thank you.
you're doing great. No,
I'm sure
no,
it is.
but
I agree.
but no, I think actually this in some sense again comes back to this inverted U curve, right? That obviously we can underinvest in self care and self investment, and we can also overinvest in that to the extent where it becomes, yeah, a project that begins to consume most of our focus and our resources, right? Um, and and I think both are genuine failure modes. Maybe even they might even be quite common actually, in the
Mm,
sense that, so I think, yeah, these are, in fact, I even kind of have two different vignettes that essentially exemplify these two excesses, let's call them. One is, yeah, this person who just overworks and doesn't get much sleep, and as a result, in fact, yeah, just has brain fog, can't focus, and makes costly mistakes in their work. That's obviously not an optimal state for being effective in the world.
mm,
And then on the other hand, we can also, there is the person who wants to be, who aims to have like the perfect peace of mind, and like being in like a, being just right in terms of how they feel internally, and their sense of clarity as to how to act in the world, right? Which can very easily end up being a form of avoidance, right? Because we realistically won't really feel like we are just right, and that we have that perfect certainty um, to about how to act. So I think that those are, yeah, real failure modes. And like, okay, I'm not sure I tied that so much to self-care, right? But in this second case, it can end up being, yeah, one can invest more and more in uh, whether it be like meditation or supplements, right? As almost like a precondition for taking action. But yeah, we don't really, at least that's what I'm arguing, that we can still take action despite having, being in a condition of various imperfections and limitations.
mhm. Yeah, so talking about psychological sustainability, guilt, burnout, despair, and hope as a theme. So yeah, a major theme of the book is caring about the extreme suffering can actually be psychologically difficult. So what do you think the main difficulties that people run into when doing this? So, but so how do we then distinguish between trying to achieve this Goldilocks zone of moral clarity, which may require understanding of extreme suffering, and it being unhealthy for us to fixate on the horror of suffering?
Yeah, that's a really tricky question, and I think like a very non-trivial balance to strike actually.
Mm,
And yeah, it's also quite nuanced, I think, because um, and I'm not sure. It would in fact be great to have studies on this. I would really appreciate that. But yeah, how to strike the right balance. So famously, there is this case made by Paul Bloom against empathy, right? His book from back in
mm,
2016. And he basically, I mean, he takes a fairly strong position, I would say, arguing that this state of feeling the feelings of others, he argues that that's not helpful at all in the moral domain. Um, and that would of course be, in some sense, a very convenient conclusion, right? That if we can push it away like that, and instead what he argues for is a rational compassion,
mm,
um, where we, and that is actually a key point, and where I do agree with Paul Bloom, that it is helpful to at least develop more of a motivation that rests on compassion, understood as the desire to alleviate other suffering, the desire and motivation to alleviate other suffering, which doesn't um, necessarily require that we strongly feel their suffering, right? So there is that important distinction, and something where there's also empirical evidence that the compassion, as this desire is in fact appears to be a stronger predictor um, of pro-social action, pro-social donations, for example, than emotional
Empathy.
empathy.
Yeah.
Yeah, although even there, it would be great to have more studies, honestly, exploring that, because it is fairly understudied. And my own view is that Bloom unfortunately overstates his case, especially on
As does
a
Gadsad.
fairly, sorry.
As does Gadsad, I think.
Okay, so right, there are
You may be
probably
familiar
various,
with
yeah.
the recent dialogue in the media. So yeah, you've discussed you've discussed Paul Bloom stuff now, but so I mean Peter Singh, sorry, not Pinker, Stephen Pinker treats empathy more like historically important for expanding moral concern, but could be limited by parochialism. And more recently, figures like Gadsad and Musk and others have used very strong language about suicidal or weaponized empathy, suggesting that empathy can become politically or civilizationally self-destructive when it overrides boundaries, punishments, and self-protection. So your view seems to be quite different here. You're saying that you criticize empathic distress and reflexive compassion, if I'm right. But you're not anti-empathy, right? It's still useful. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, look, how
I mean,
would you
so
distinguish your view than these more sort of hardline anti-empathy or pathological empathy framings?
yeah, I mean, maybe a simple way to put it is, again, to get back to this uh, inverted U curve, right? I do
Yes.
actually agree that I think there is a kernel of truth when they say that you can in some sense have too much of this, or at least it can end up guiding your actions and decisions in too much of a reflexive manner, right? It becomes too knee jerk, so to speak. Um, so, but of course, and this is actually where I think Paul Bloom kind of makes a mistake, that he's pointing to these actually quite uncontroversial pitfalls of empathy, emotional empathy, and from that he seems to infer that we should have none of it. And I think that's just, and I'm not alone, by the way. There are many people who have criticized that inference, that's saying, well, just because you can have it in excess, or perhaps in a way that's insufficiently regulated, doesn't really mean that we do better by having none at all. Um, so yeah, I do think it's a matter of maybe dosing it better, and then also combining it with other other tools or capacities, right? So, for example, having capacities for reflection, right? To step back and in a reasoned way try to weigh different kinds of considerations, and yeah, make balanced assessments that aren't just driven by like some immediate reflex, right? But conversely, the empathy itself, like both compassion and emotional empathy, they do seem to be able to play helpful motivational roles, right? To actually
Mm.
move us to take action. Because even one can even make these moral calculations, right? But there still does need to be something that drives us to actually take action on them, right? Which is not guaranteed um, just by calculation alone, right? So yeah,
Mm.
so I think in that way it is uh, quite nuanced, and one, it's maybe also worth acknowledging that it can be a very inconvenient conclusion, right? To say that if emotional empathy is helpful to some extent, right? But even if that's very inconvenient, it might nevertheless be true that it can play some helpful role. But with that being said, I do think many readers of compassionate purpose um, will, I suspect they will tend to be maybe have too much empathic distress, right? And could likely benefit from leaning more into compassion, focusing on reinforcing this desire to reduce suffering without reinforcing this idea that I must share the suffering or all of it, right? Which can be, yeah, like a recipe for overwhelm.
Mm-hmm. Mm. I guess that's true for the readers who are reading compassionate ethics. Sorry, compassionate purpose. For the very express purpose of becoming a more compassionate and a more effective person at being moral, I guess. But the general public who hear these terms, it's a very delicate line to walk where you can preserve the nuance of the issue as well at the same time as not compressing it enough so that it's attractive and gains traction, gets attention. I'm worried about the lensing. Some of these debates online where people are saying, like Gad said, and people are sort of using this moral issue, this finding, for political purposes. Like I feel like some of these debates seem so easily rhetorically hijacked where what you do, I don't know what people are taking away from these debates. They might take away the fact, empathy is bad. And with that, then walk away thinking, compassion and general ethics or concern for other people is bad. It's opening the floodgates for people to walk all over your face. And so I'm worried that people are just taking away that. So what do you think is the danger of saying empathy is the weakness rather than saying something like empathy, needs to be disciplined by reason, impartiality, and attention to consequences and details. And so, yeah, I mean, how do you avoid these lensing issues?
Yeah, I share those concerns. It does seem like it can become, yeah, almost politicized and become like a very tribal dynamic
Mm,
where, which I think obviously that can often flatten discourse a lot, right? Where, because we often end up in this state where we want to maybe signal our loyalties to particular tribes, and then that's pretty much a precondition for killing nuance, right?
mm,
That if one wants to uh, introduce nuance to that kind of discussion, yeah, that it's that's a very a very difficult thing to do. And what's also interesting to note in that regard is that actually I don't think compassion is actually all that controversial as a very basic value, in the sense of concern for suffering is something that generally, at least, um, most people don't support. I mean, most people would agree with reducing suffering if, for example, it could be done just at the push of a button. Um, and also, there are like surveys of how people yeah, generally agree with prioritizing the reduction of suffering. It's a fairly common view, but I guess what often then becomes the matter of dispute is um, which particular groups or individuals that people have compassion for, or most compassion for, right? That does seem to be like the the contentious part. Um, I don't really know so much how one can, like, an effective way to address this, other than, I mean, I have written an essay that's called "In Defense of Nuance," where I
mm,
actually try to, yeah, that I it's like my some of my suggestions as to how one could maybe improve some of these uh, dynamics of discourse, namely that, I mean, very often, right, when we have these kinds of political disagreements, the pattern tends to be that, yeah, like there can be, with some nuanced topic, right, one side might choose to emphasize one particular aspect, and another side might choose to emphasize like maybe an opposite side. or aspect of that of the issue, and it then becomes like this very becomes very selective and like cherry picking from different sides. And I think one way to potentially ease that is to be willing to have, yeah, to be more willing to actually acknowledge good points on both sides, like
Mm,
sort of a both and perspective. That, for example, in this case, like, yes, it obviously compassion is a sensible value to have. It makes sense to have concern for suffering. And yes, one can obviously do that in very bad ways, right? Where one fails to take um, various, pitfalls into consideration, such as, I don't know, you neglect certain consequences of being, say, maybe too lenient in certain cases, right? So yeah, I guess that's like maybe one of the, I don't know. It's not necessarily an easy thing to sell, but I do suspect that greater nuance can be helpful
mhm,
in these
mm,
kinds of debates.
I agree. I guess talking about like polarization, it's very easy for me to find myself doom scrolling for longer than than I should.
Right.
So this year, I'd like I don't know why, like it maybe it's just sort of worry mechanism in my brain that kicks in, and I just scroll, and hopefully at the end of this scroll, I find you know, an angelic barlog that solves all the world's problems. But I
Where's it?
haven't
It
found one
must be
yet.
there somewhere.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 But no, look,
You always stop right before it comes at them, I'm sure.
that's right. Yeah. I don't know. Like, yeah. So, I mean, like, yeah. How do you? What's your advice for addicted doom scrollers then?
Yeah, good question. So actually, I do have like a brief subsection where I explore that a little bit. And well, so one thing that's actually very yeah, people who study self-discipline, they tend to, many of them strongly favor what's called situational strategies, which simply involves changing the actual environment around us, which can mean using website blockers, or for example, deleting an app, or simply putting the phone away while working. So yeah, and there's a lot of uh, support for those strategies, and of course it makes sense, right? That if one makes discipline the default, so to speak, that it yeah just simply becomes a lot easier. In my own case, I tend to one way, and of course this can also be applied to work in particular. So I tend to always drive out to work on public at a public library. So yeah, that's a very nice setting that is very conducive to concentration. I find. So yeah, tips like that. That's certainly one thing that can be helpful. Then there is also some evidence that yeah, so seemingly this approach to therapy called metacognitive therapy also has some support when it comes to reducing internet addiction. And the core of metacognitive therapy is actually that one updates one's own beliefs about one's own thinking, or yeah, one's mind more broadly, which can also include, for example, one's beliefs about indeed like the value of, say, scrolling, right, or staying up to date with the news, because we might often have some kind of maybe implicit or unexamined sense that we need to stay on top of things, like maybe the latest event, what just happened, and we need to stay on top of that. But and so those underlying maybe implicit beliefs can often drive that behavior, and it might be helpful to then uh, yeah, try to examine those beliefs to a greater extent. Like, so is it actually a genuine need to stay up to date with this, the latest news, or the news, the feed of updates, compared to, say, alternative activities that one might at the end of the day value more. or that might contribute more in general. So yeah, those kinds of approaches I think can be potentially quite helpful to change the environment and to also change maybe one's underlying beliefs or like habitual drives maybe in some cases.
Hmm. You write about empathic distress and Weltschmerz. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's a wonderful German word. Um, what do these terms mean? You know, and how do they apply to? What do they capture that you think ordinary language might not?
Yeah, it's actually, yeah, it's a good question what alternative words one could use, but like empathic distress in itself, like reasonably a descriptive term, right? Is the
Yes.
distress we can have when feeling empathy for others, like the distress in ourselves about yeah what others are experiencing. And I think Weltschmerz, which basically, if one translates it literally, is just world pain,
Mm.
can be seen as it's basically like empathic distress about the world as a whole or the world's pain in general. So it's a in that way has it's on a larger scale and can be more overwhelming. I think yeah, it's a good question. I guess there just isn't really an established English term, and I guess Weltschmerz has become probably has become the English term, a bit like Schadenfreude.
Yeah, like
Um,
Schadenfreude. Yeah, I like the sound of it because it does have this sort of dramatic seriousness to it, you know. Um,
right, yeah, and
yeah.
but so I think, and this is something that yeah, I think many people who, even without necessarily ever using that term or any of these terms, many people who focus on reducing suffering will be familiar with these kinds of feelings and be challenged by them. I have myself as well a lot, um, and so yeah. Then the question as to how one can then better like address these challenges and reduce them to the extent they are excessive. So one way is what we actually already touched on, namely shifting more towards a compassion-based motivation,
Mm.
tapping into desire to reduce suffering and having less of a felt duty almost even to directly feel the pain of the world, because I think that can actually sometimes be a driver that we have this sense that I should be feeling their pain more. um,
Mm.
yeah, that can motivate that we take it in more, even to a point that um, is likely even excessive. That is one thing, and another is, I mean, that it also another strategy that's related is to I mean it can tie in a lot to guilt as well, and some yeah, so feeling guilty about being okay, for example, is a relatively can be a fairly common experience in when observing others who are suffering, um, and some ways to address that kind of guilt maybe to, again, first of all, internalize that that kind of guilt generally isn't so helpful, that we can, for the most part, better help others if we are ourselves in a good state, and that we have more of a focus on actually being well ourselves and taking action for other beings, which will benefit them more compared to to feeling guilty.
Hmm.
Another
Well, you
strategy,
defend
and
a realistic hope, right? You defend
yeah,
like
that's
this
right.
idea that, you know, there's this point at which there's stuff that we can't solve. There's suffering that we just can't solve. It might be on another planet, or you know, it might be insect suffering happening right now. It could be something like, you know, there's wars going on that there's nothing much we can really do about that at that scale. But you defend realistic hope. So what makes hope realistic rather than wishful? right?
Yeah, yeah. I think it comes down to how we understand the whole, certainly, right? So a lot of people would, I think, criticize having hope, maybe especially in like pessimistic circles, would yeah, criticize any kind of hope when it comes to the reduction of extreme suffering. And by and large, depending on the nature of that hope, I might agree with them, right? That many kinds of hope are unrealistic, right? It's unrealistic to think that we can just immediately solve like ongoing suffering from today till tomorrow or even the next year or so. So many kinds of hope that we may be very tempted to have are probably uh, not realistic. But then that's I think where it's important to um, yeah, like to have a more refined conception of what the hope might consist in, right? Because yeah, almost by definition, right, there are some forms of impact that are realistic, right? There are some um, the realistically achievable reductions of suffering, right? That are things we changes that we can bring about. They are obviously realistic, and it I think we can reasonably have a hope for yeah for achieving that whatever does lie within the yeah the bounds of achievable changes, which granted in the large scheme of things it might be all too modest, like maybe tragically modest in terms of ongoing suffering, but it is nevertheless still a real difference that I think is worth, very much worth taking seriously, right? And worth applying ourselves to realize. So that's the sense in which, yeah, I argue that we can have a realistic hope for reducing suffering or yeah, for compassionate impact, and it's one that I think we have good reason to actually to cultivate and to make salient because it turns out that the psychology of hope is something that is fairly significant. That one could even argue that we have a strong need for hope because hope turns out is such a strong component of human well-being. Something that I didn't really know when I set out to write the book, but I guess it does make sense that yeah that it can play a large role and also indeed a motivating role. So there was even a study where hope predicted academic performance over and beyond various other usual predictors. So it's actually something that can yeah have a significant motivating effect as well.
Definitely. Well, there's another motivating H word, and that's humor. So, what do you
Right.
think is the role of humor? Lightheartedness, music, beauty, the ordinary joys in life, you know. When you've got a life devoted to reducing suffering, what's the role of humor?
Yeah, I think it can actually have many different helpful roles. One is simply to indeed, it can be a kind of refuge, right, from what can otherwise feel like a perpetual sternness or maybe even like darkness. So yeah, it can be something that can help bring some lightness to us personally. But then in addition, this can also apply even at a social and collective level, right? That it's much more inviting and motivating that if you have I mean it's like a basic social lubricant, right? To have humor, and without it, it just you sort of end up with something that's very stale and uninviting, right? As a matter of social dynamics and social functioning. So that's one, yeah, like these motivating functions and providing some relief can be really valuable. In addition, I also think humor is actually a very valuable tool of critique and scrutiny, right? That
Mm,
often humor can cut through various taboos
yeah.
in ways that ordinary forms of more like direct critique can't, because it is
Mm,
humor can be very disarming, and I think that can also both apply in an outward facing manner or like at a social level, but also it can also be a powerful way potentially of self scrutiny. If we can look at some of our own maybe flaws or however we want to frame them in a humorous light, that can be a way to maybe better be more willing to actually to look at them as opposed to feeling like we have to suppress them, and it might make us less defensive around them. If we can be like, yeah, sure, I am a doom scroller also. Let me just admit
Hmm.
it. Right.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned different types of humor. I think you mentioned in the book a meta modern humor. I was wondering what's that? What is that? Hmm.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So in fact, I guess some people have argued that meta modern, like that our current moment is in various ways meta-modern, and there are various ways of actually defining meta-modernism, but I think a common way is that
Is
it's
Hans
this
Freinach in the
movement.
audience? No.
That's fine. Like, yeah, yeah. So he's, yeah, a meta-modern political philosopher who has written the book The Listening Society and Nordic Ideology. So someone who defends like meta-modernism in a political way. But I think it's often been defined as, sometimes I think another word has been postmodernism, where the idea is of integrating both modernism and postmodernism, both integrating, like transcend and include, I think is a term that's at least often used when it comes to what defines metamodernism. There's actually also a paper about metamodern culture, which has often been where it started actually. And maybe it's an easy or one way to maybe present metamodernism might be to mention examples of it from culture. I think a common and yeah, maybe the a standard example of metamodern culture is the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once. So combining like a sort of meta-modern ridiculousness and sort of far out there-ness with nevertheless like something that has a lot of depth and seriousness. Um, yeah, I can recommend watching that movie. I quite enjoyed it myself. But so yeah, this like oscillation of having both the lightheartedness, the silliness, and then combining that with seriousness, including like being willing to go deep into our own personal emotional difficulties and also the difficult realities beyond ourselves. And in that way, in fact, I think that is an example of what the book in itself touches on when, yeah, when discussing humor, um, and reducing suffering together, right? These are not usually things that we connect with each other, but I do actually think that there can be an integration in some sense, and that there can be, yeah, at least that the humor can actually play a meaningful or supportive role.
Yeah, I
I
agree.
don't know if that quite answered your question. I'm not really,
Yeah,
unfortunately, a meta-modern theorist, but there are some who
yeah.
are, and I do recommend looking into it. One thing that maybe another thing that's kind of defining about it, and maybe something that I think the effective altruism movement could perhaps integrate to a greater extent, is that in metamodernism there is this, at least for example, as promoted by Hansi Freinacht, there is both this sense of concern for the well-being of all beings, but then in addition to that, there's also an emphasis on understanding everyone's perspectives. And I think that's actually an important additional step, that is not just that you have this kind of maybe paternalistic concern for other beings, but there's also this cognitive empathy, perspective taking aspect of what are other beings actually, yeah, how do they see the world? And yeah, I think that's something that's maybe also often sorely needed if we also go back to this thing about polarization and difficult discussions and the like.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. I had a discussion about moral realism at the last EA conference in Melbourne, and yeah, I met somebody. In fact, I've known him for a while who subscribes to metamodernism a meta ethical standpoint. So,
Okay,
yeah, I thought that was
interesting.
interesting. Yeah. Let's move on to self compassion in the face of adversity. Like you devote a whole chapter on self compassion. So, why is self compassion so central to compassionate purpose? And yeah.
Yeah, this was something that I didn't really. I mean, it sort of just fell out of the empirical literature, I guess. That it
Mm,
turns out that self compassion is just, yeah. First of all, just in association studies, it turns out it's a very strong predictor of, yeah, all sorts of um, valuable traits, like for example, having greater resilience and even, yeah, for example, lower tendency also to procrastinate, also lower rates of stress, depression, and anxiety. And there are also experimental studies with self compassion interventions where similar effects are observed. And in fact, especially strong, it seems, is the association between. So self compassion seems especially helpful for um, eating disorders, actually, with, yeah, self compassion interventions, and of particular importance to. So that's just like a general observation. It seems really, really psychologically valuable. But then also for those who seek to reduce suffering, it turns out that low self compassion or even harsh self criticism is actually a fairly significant predictor of altruistic burnout, or what's sometimes called compassion fatigue. So, yeah, that seemingly makes it of special relevance to those who seek to reduce suffering, or, yeah, or help others. And there are in fact also experimental studies on that where interventions help reduce that form of burnout. So it simply turns out empirically, it seems to be quite important to increase our self compassion, or perhaps especially reduce harsh self criticism, which can perhaps be common, and maybe even not so, maybe even almost unconscious, right? If one notices a lot of suffering around, that it might, for some people, be almost like a reflex to say, oh, why am I not doing more? Why am I not contributing more? And this, oh, I'm doing so badly. I suck for not helping out more, which maybe in some ways can be an understandable sentiment, but is not really helpful. On the contrary, it's actually quite counterproductive to be harsh on ourselves in that way. Oh, sorry, I'm not hearing you, Adam.
sorry. Yeah, I was just saying that people cling to self criticism as a motivational tool, thinking that it's going to, stoically make better of themselves by doing so. But there's a big difference between self compassion as a motivator and self criticism as a motivator.
Yeah. So people sometimes give this analogy of a coach, right? How would we ideally want a coach to speak to the players or to us? Um, so yeah, I mean, a coach who's just always shouting at people or berating us, right? If we happen to, I don't know, miss a shot or the like, that's not
Mm.
really so helpful
Reminds me
in
of
the
the
long run.
canonical drill sergeant in an army
Right.
movie, right? Really,
And
really strict.
and in fairness, I mean, it might even work as maybe a very short-term motivational boost, but it's not really a long-term motivator, right? It's not the person you want to be your coach, like nonstop for decades, right? And maybe it's a good framing that effectively we we can serve as our own coach, right? Both for good and ill. And yeah, I mean, so then the flip side of the analogy, right, is that obviously a better coach will be someone who is generally supportive, right? Someone who is willing to notice when there is a mistake, but who's supportive in yeah, moving in better directions. So rather than berating, it can be like, yeah, this is really difficult, and that was a genuine flaw, that's or mistake that we made there, but we can move in a better direction, and I'm gonna support myself in that.
Okay. So yeah, so you draw on a lot of these psychology techniques like CBT, ACT, metacognitive therapy, Stoicism, Buddhism, trauma-informed approaches. So, which of all these, I think, yeah, which of these, do you think is been most useful to you personally?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, well, this in fact again has been partly informed by. It was interesting with metacognitive therapy. That was in fact something that I added to the book later, um, because I only discovered it later in the process. But I've come to see it as, and in fact, the studies on it turns out are quite promising. So in meta analyses, again, this is still like not that many studies, but at least if one looks at the currently available studies, metacognitive therapy generally seems better for like more have larger effect sizes for generalized anxiety and depression compared to CBT. But
Hmm.
I do think one does need to interpret the literature with some caution, partly also because there is this thing called the allegiance effect in
Hmm.
in psychology, where people who are very much in favor or have allegiance to a particular approach to therapy, they may be biased, right, in favor of it. So for that reason, one needs to interpret it with caution. But nevertheless, there's actually also there's a separate meta-analysis where they looked at, that was in fact PTSD, where they also found, and they looked at many different therapeutic modalities there, but they also found metacognitive therapy to be the one that had the largest effect size in that meta-analysis. So there does seem to be some support for that approach, and it is actually also interestingly an approach that's uh, it has some meaningful differences compared to CBT, because where with CBT one would often engage with thoughts and try to push back on thoughts, to sort of, yeah, argue against them a bit to make counterpoints. But in MCT, the approach, metacognitive therapy, the approach is often simply to step back and actually not engage with the thoughts at all. That one a core practice is what's called detached mindfulness. That a common analogy there is, or metaphor is, that you have a worry phone that's ringing, right, and that is sort of enticing you to engage, but you simply step back and you allow the phone to ring. That you don't, you sort of observe, don't engage, is, yeah, often a summary of that approach. And yeah, it seems that that's is quite effective for many people, along with then also, as I mentioned a bit earlier, this thing of changing our own implicit beliefs about well, so actually in metacognitive therapy there is what's called, often called, positive metacognitive beliefs and then negative metacognitive beliefs. And the positive metacognitive beliefs are where you think that you need to do certain things to be okay. So this can, for example, help drive maybe OCD, that you need to think certain thoughts, you need to perhaps over prepare, or yeah, make a lot of careful preparations for something, even though these things might not actually be helpful. So positive metacognitive beliefs in that sense are not necessarily positive, but it's just beliefs that drive maybe more mental activity in some sense. And then on the other hand, there are so-called negative metacognitive beliefs, which are about the belief that certain thoughts or sensations or emotions are dangerous. So, oh no, I shouldn't be having this thought. It's dangerous, even though it generally generally that thoughts and sensations in themselves are not actually dangerous. So that can be a way in which we can sort of yeah, like overstate the significance of certain thoughts and experiences. And a core theoretical claim of metacognitive therapy is that a lot of our problems actually arise from sort of having inaccurate beliefs at these metacognitive levels. So some inaccurate positive metacognitive beliefs about the need to prepare and the value of worrying, for example, which can lead us to worry excessively because we simply overestimate the value of it, the need for it. And likewise, that we can make ourselves very yeah, like we can make our worries also much worse by then seeing them as being dangerous to us, right? Or like sensations or thoughts that we may happen to, that might just appear and emerge, and we can then make them much worse than they actually are, with these perhaps some yeah inaccurate beliefs about their danger or significance in terms of what they actually mean. So in that way, I think yeah, metacognitive therapy is a way to sort of dial down the maybe our own mental chaos in some ways,
Mm.
because we become less inclined to yeah to reinforce it, to engage with it. And then even when that kind of happens, we become more relaxed about it because it's actually not as big of a deal as we can sometimes make it out to be. But I mean, with that being said, I also think a lot of proponents, I think this is very common actually in therapy, right? A lot of proponents of different schools, they can sort of maybe both overstate the significance or maybe the utility of a particular approach, and also maybe also understate the variability, right? Where it might be really what some people can benefit from, right? Whereas other people might benefit from another approach.
Mm.
I do think that, I mean, with that being said, there are like some general capacities that do seem like very broadly useful. Like something like, for example, increasing distress tolerance. So actually becoming better able to handle distress, to experience distress without necessarily, yeah, making it out to be something like without panicking about it, or yeah, um, and becoming better at actually sitting with it as opposed to some kind of engaging in avoidance behavior. So that's something that is really quite shared across many different modalities, and many, I should also say, many therapeutic modalities do also tend to converge on very like shared capacities also, such as I mentioned detached mindfulness, and there are various different names for like essentially the same capacity, yeah, across different modalities of essentially stepping back and observing one's experience without uh, yeah without engaging with it, and sort of yeah, sometimes there's this metaphor of scratching a wound. So like the wound is never going to heal if we keep on scratching it, and that's often this idea of stepping back, that our mind can in some ways actually yeah almost like heal itself if we give it some space. Yeah, but
Mm.
obviously it is a complicated field, and it's again an area where yeah it would be great if we had more data, but nevertheless I do think we can be sort of like relatively confident in, at least when it comes to these some of these key capacities, which by the way yeah very much include self-compassion, and also having these metacognitive capacities for stepping back and observing and creating some distance from our experiences.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. Yeah, I really appreciate the fact that you've done so much research into these areas, and I think it's very useful for aspiring ultras to engage in, self self help along these lines. So it's a really amazing book. You discuss this second arrow and reducing resistance to unavoidable suffering, right? How does that help people trying to reduce suffering in the world, and how do we prevent it from becoming passive acceptance of avoiding suffering? So you can't fix it all, but we don't want to become just a passive acceptor of avoidable suffering. So yeah, the second arrow. What's all this about?
Yeah, yeah. So um, that's a common metaphor in Buddhism where the first arrow of suffering, that's like the aversive experience itself. It might be some pain itself, or some event that happened that might have made us sad. And then the second arrow of suffering is this distress that we can have about that first um, pain, or instance of misery itself, where we can, it might often be accompanied by thoughts like, oh, I shouldn't be having this experience, or like, this is just ruining my day, or ruining everything. So, and that's a way that we can sort of make, in effect, make our experience even worse. And that's not just actually like, um, these are not just ancient Buddhist claims, because there are actually studies on this where it turns out, even for pain management, even for people with relatively severe instances of pain, that it can actually be quite helpful, it turns out, to practice greater acceptance of it, as counterintuitive as that can sound. And where it can help us when it comes to reducing the suffering of others, suffering in general, I think first of all, it can be helpful to, yeah, like, just as a general matter, if we suffer less, that's generally helps us make us more capable as agents for change. But in addition, it's actually also, there's also a more direct, a closer connection when it comes to the and it ties also back to the empathic distress that we can feel, right? Because often a reason we don't want to face suffering is that it can feel very bad for us. But if we can build up more of a, greater capacities for distress tolerance, and which is actually like a form of this acceptance, right? One can say of the distress that might emerge in us. Then that can in turn make us more capable and more willing to actually face the suffering that's out there. If the pain of facing suffering becomes less of a, less of a block from our turning toward it, and trying to reduce it, right? So in that way, reducing our own suffering and our own empathic distress, and not just like reducing it, but also increasing our capacity to handle it, that can really be, quite a helpful tool in trying to face it. Because after all, I would say this is actually often one of the main hurdles, right? To like, why don't we face suffering more? Why don't we turn more toward it? And I think often the answer is, it's too overwhelming. It's too difficult. It just is just too, sure. I mean, if I could just look at it and I could just be um, uh, like still be a happy person. I think, yeah, for many people that it would be a different story, right? So that's why I think it actually can make a lot of sense. Also, with an eye to the suffering out there in the wider world.
Yeah, great explanation. Um, do you think that, well, you suggest that suffering can help deepen compassion. So, how do we talk about that without romanticizing the suffering? Do you think that people who have suffered very little be deeply compassionate as well? So, a few questions in that one.
Yeah, yeah. So first of all, yeah, I think that it's definitely possible to have compassion without suffering very deeply oneself. I mean, I think there are instances of that. So I don't think the literature at all suggests that it's like um, yeah, a necessary condition, right? That one has suffered a lot oneself. But with that being said, it's true that there is considerable evidence that that past suffering, it does yeah, seem to predict greater compassion and even also taking greater action for to reduce other suffering. So there is that, and maybe in some ways it's maybe not so surprising that if one perhaps has if one has a deep understanding of suffering, then it's understandable how that can be a motivator to reduce it. And in fact, it turns out this even applies. One study, it wasn't just past suffering that, perhaps surprisingly, there was also a study where people, while they were experiencing pain compared to a control group, those who were in a pain condition actually also made more sympathetic moral judgment towards others. So yeah, it does seem like it can have a helpful effect, but again, it's a very nuanced issue in the sense that obviously suffering can also lead to embitterment and can be incapacitating, right? So it's a case of there being a very fine balance, and I'm by no means recommending that people seek out suffering to gain these kinds of benefits. Like ideally, yeah, we want to find better ways to motivate us to reduce suffering, such as yeah, cultivating greater compassion, as mentioned earlier, which maybe like specifically one can practice compassion meditation, for example. And yeah, how can one discuss that issue without romanticizing suffering? I mean, I think what I just mentioned might be an important part of it, right? Mentioning that, well, suffering obviously can also have negative secondary consequences, right? In addition to, of course, pointing out that suffering in itself is intrinsically bad and worth preventing for its own sake. And I guess it's also, yeah, and also like stressing this point about it being one possible path to compassion, but not necessarily the only one, not necessarily even like the most effective one. Um, yeah, those would be some of the main points I would highlight. I was, in fact, I was a bit concerned while writing the book, not to yeah, veer into that kind of romanticization, because obviously that's I think unfortunately it's also like a common, maybe in itself can be a form of disengagement actually, right? So it's almost like a rationalization to say, oh, but isn't suffering also good in some ways, right? Which in fact I'm willing to grant, right? But then in like a very like particular and constrained sense where it can have some benefits. And the way I would mainly frame it, I think the utility of suffering, I think the the most useful way to look at it is mainly, or to use that insight. I think it's the most useful when in the case where either while you are suffering or when looking back at past suffering, right? It's not something where I think in, because that's a case where, well, if the suffering is unavoidable, then okay, let's try to make the best of it, obviously. Yeah, it's not in a forward looking way something that I suggest should lead us to be, yeah, any less dedicated to reducing suffering, right? Which is maybe sometimes the way in which this point is brought up. Maybe I can also mention as a more specific practice, because I just mentioned this aspect of like while we are suffering, how might we transform that into compassion, so to speak, which is actually a framing found in, there's this practice of Tonglen, and this American Buddhist nun named Pema Chodron. She has written about this practice of Tonglen, which she frames it as transforming suffering into compassion, or breathing in suffering, breathing out compassion. And a practice there is to, for example, while one is experiencing suffering, one can try to use that, as difficult as it can be, to try to use that suffering and its badness to sort of reinforce our own commitment to reducing the suffering of others. A specific practice might be, so if one is currently experiencing, say, a headache, one might start by wishing relief for all beings who are currently experiencing a headache, and then proceed to maybe wish relief for all beings who are currently in some kind of physical pain, and then finally trying to wish relief for the suffering of all beings. So like starting with that concrete state of one's own headache to finally, yeah, ending at a state in a position of compassion for all beings. So like almost like a 180 reversal of, yeah, one's focus. And I do actually think it can be, that's one way in which suffering actually can be a motivator. But I also think it might not really happen automatically. It might help a lot if we, yeah, are willing to, given that we experience suffering, are willing to use it for that, yeah, motivational purpose, and make that reframing.
Hmm. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, I'll have a look into that actually. um, yeah, so I mean, this is a bit of an off-topic thing, but do you think AI needs to experience suffering in order for it to appreciate the need for reducing suffering? Like, does it have to, do you think it needs to have, or do you think it would be beneficial for it to sample that kind of qualia in order for it to be adequately motivated to do the right thing?
That's actually is a very interesting question. I mean, I think in some sense there are certainly some arguments and reasons for prioritizing suffering that do rely on that, right? So for example, introspective arguments, they would, as far as I can tell, they would pretty much require that one can actually do the introspection, right? Run the actual experiment in question. But then with that being said, I mean, there are, of course, arguments that perhaps have more of a purely formal character, one could say, right, where it wouldn't be necessary. So like, for example, if one starts out with some kind of axiom that focuses, it might be a kind of prioritarianism where one is
Mm.
concerned with those who are the worst off. So obviously from that kind of perspective, it almost follows as a formal matter that one would prioritize suffering. Granted that that's one of the ways beings can be badly off is by suffering, right? But of course, that's ultimately it is relatively narrow, right? If to reduce ethics purely to that kind of formal level, and after all, one could say the way in which we assess the plausibility of different like formal actions or the like would be, or premises would presumably be that we have some kind of um, yeah, more direct experiential basis, right, for, yeah, for probing their plausibility.
Yeah, I mean, like, if an AI were to discover axioms, or if it weren't like hardwired with axioms from the word go, um, it may discover or converge on axioms based on groundedness, or that could be some sort of empirical result. It feels suffering is bad, and therefore it knows that suffering is bad, right? So yeah, yeah. Where do axioms? Why would an AI settle on the axiom that suffering is bad, over and above any other axiom out there that it could converge on?
Yeah, and then one can say that if one looks at like current real world AI systems, uh, which are interestingly like sort of, one could say, like a direct outgrowth, right, of our whatever we have written on the internet, right, when it comes to LLMs. it does seem like that AI systems have, one could say, I guess, that they de facto do display some kind of concern for suffering, right? In terms of, I don't know, like expressed values, expressed preferences, um, which of course is, yeah, I guess, to put it mildly, like very strongly derivative, right, from our various judgments, like I suppose both from the internet and then also from the the yeah, the post training
Mm,
process, right, or after the pre training,
mm.
what gets reinforced. So yeah, that's like an interesting real world example where I guess we can there appears to be some kind of a version of some function, a version of some functional concern, right, that's there, but doesn't seem introspectively based, actually more, well, indirectly maybe based on human, yeah, experience and introspection and sympathy and the like.
Yeah, it's interesting. And this is part of why I think moral realism is useful when thinking about alignment, in that if these, whether you can call them axioms that AIs have in order to, reduce suffering, is just down to um, our training data and our post-training reinforcement from human feedback or reinforcement from AI feedback, then it could go the other way, right? I mean, we could have AIs that are trained on specific values, or the training data is flooded with particular ideological stances, so that pre-training it comes out, favoring a particular ideology, or and after reinforcement even further. So if we do end up with something like a superintelligence, and it's not just beholden to its initial training data, I wonder if at some stage it'll become agentic enough to want to self-discover what is real value in the universe. So yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a it's very hard to think about these sorts of things too seriously, because we don't have that kind of AI, and we can't know that we have that kind of AI. But yeah, I don't want to like suggest that we should put too much hope in this sort of thing either. I mean, I did notice that you don't really talk a lot about AI in your book, but you do mention it a couple of times, and one of them is in connection to wishful solutionism, which maybe that was what we were thinking about when I started talking about this,
No,
about
not
suffering
actually, no.
risk. But I understand the concern. Like, AI could amplify suffering enormously. So you do also say that AI has got a risk of increasing suffering, and I think that that's highly possible if it's, for instance, if it converges on some kind of good-hearted, good-heartian sort of proxy on real value, but the proxy could be smiley faces, but doesn't actually converge on the actual reason why we want smiley faces, and that's because we want joy, and just tiles the universe with smiley faces. Just focusing on its goal is purely just make smiley faces. That would be horrible. Um, so yeah, so there also seems to be a major positive case that AI could help reduce suffering, but in a sense that comes along this sort of cloud of disempowerment, that you know if it's so good at reducing suffering, what can we do to reduce suffering and all that sort of thing? So, but if we take the idea seriously that AI could be motivated, um, if it had the right motivation, the right moral motivation, that could be like a really, really outsizely good thing to achieve, to the degree it could be achieved. Yeah. So I do hope that at some stage we can achieve some kind of truly more moral than the average human AI. not just in capability, the ability to produce polished responses to moral questions, but having a real moral motivation, or value motivation. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it's obviously a huge topic, and it's also a lot more maybe urgent than most of us realize, and in various
Mm,
ways actually. So not only in the sense that yeah, the responses that large language models give and how that, I mean, currently can influence our moral discussions, but even also at the level of, so my understanding is, and I don't know as much about this as I should like, but my understanding is that currently AI systems are already being employed in animal agriculture, even in some cases are performing slaughter procedures, for example, right? So it's a hugely yeah, relevant issue, to put it
mm,
mildly, right? Also at that level, not only at the level of yeah, purely responses and the like. So and it's also surprisingly like the scale, right, can be very difficult to comprehend, right? Because suddenly if one automates slaughterhouse workers, right, to think about how vast of a scale that actually is, right? We're talking about, well, potentially billions of sentient beings or even more.
mm-hmm,
So, like for example, in the case of the fishing industry, that's it's more than a trillion fish
mm-hmm,
every year that yeah, that are killed by humanity. So yeah, it's a vast scale, and it does seem to be a plausible lever, and that's also why an increasing number of people in this community are starting to focus on AI as a focus area. So there's the group previously called, I think it was called AI for Animals, now called Sentient Futures.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. I know about them. Yeah, I've watched a couple
yeah,
of their videos. Yeah.
yeah. So they're very much focused on this intersection of issues, and actually they're doing they are arranging a lot of organizing conferences both in London and the Bay Area, and are actually very much a community organizing group. So it's one where one can also become part of a community actually, if one shares those concerns. It's a growing community, which is
Mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah, yeah,
heartening to
yeah.
see.
I should hook in. Yeah, my concern is that the way that we use AI for these purposes that you mentioned may inadvertently give it training that might domesticate it in a way that it ends up taking these, like, I guess, having a value system sort of inadvertently emerge within it. That once it scales and becomes more powerful, may have sort of nasty side effects with us, right?
Yeah,
um,
and
yeah.
I understand this is already the case because just recently there was like a pre-publication released by Lucius Caviola and colleagues, a study where they looked at speciesism in AI models, where they had pretty much inherited human biases in the sense that they would normalize the exploitation of certain groups of animals, but not companion animals. Right. So there was this this strong bias had been inherited by the AI models, right, based on how humans tend to value these beings. Which, yeah, I think there's a very strong argument to be made that that is a bias.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I'll have to look that up. So, do you worry that suffering-focused ethics can become uh, asymmetric about technology? Do you, they're very alert that it might become sort of very focused on ways technologies could create vast suffering, but more skeptical or muted about the way that it could also prevent suffering. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm also interested in the second question. I'd like to know if AI could help a lot in prevention of suffering. That's part why I'd like to know empirically whether AI could, whether its motivation could be shaped in such a way, at least shaped along a trajectory in a way that might sort of converge on higher values that would preserve life and reduce suffering in non-catastrophic ways. Mm. But yeah, so
Yeah.
can it do both?
Yeah, I mean, I think both sides are extremely important, and I do think, right, so, and I think AI systems, like, they actually have potential upsides in many different ways, right? So, and one of them is, for example, that they can also help us, well, both actually at the level of just moral reflection, right? They might help us gain a deeper appreciation of maybe some of the reasons for prioritizing the reduction of suffering. And also at the practical level, not least, they might help us gain insights, maybe especially as the AI systems become more advanced. They might, yeah, help us gain better insights, maybe original insights even about how we can better reduce suffering, right? So in that way, which is obviously an area where we have a lot to learn still, right? So there's a
Mm.
lot of potential there, and I think it is important not to end up with like a one-sided view of the potential in that way. With that being said, it is worth noting that there is, in some sense, there is a bit of an asymmetry relative to our current condition, in the sense that, at least when we speak in terms of potential, there does seem to be more potential for increasing suffering than for reducing it, considering like the current, yeah, how much suffering currently exists compared to how much suffering there could exist if, yeah, if for example, if one considers space expansion and the like, or even just if one were to uh, effectivize or, yeah, increase harmful practices further on Earth, right, and increase suffering on Earth. So in that sense, it does seem like technology can have a, unfortunately, like an asymmetric potential from a suffering focused perspective. But it's one also, it can, even that can depend a little bit on the framing, right? Because one could also say that, if the current trajectory is such that we're headed towards a vast increase in suffering, then it's also possible that at least some technical interventions could actually have asymmetric potential in the opposite direction. Um, I mean, I don't know. I haven't thought so much about this in detail, but at least it's conceivable that one could, yeah, have like that kind of counterfactual impact, that could be, yeah, highly beneficial, and ideally, of course, we would want to find uh, interventions that have that kind of like, that are asymmetric in a favorable direction, right? That would tend to have a lot of upside with limited downside, which unfortunately is very difficult to find, right? Because there is a lot of uncertainty, and most interventions can unfortunately generally backfire in ways that we might not be able to predict. But yeah, it still seems to me that it's worth looking for, yeah, such interventions and exploring the possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, Julian Savulescu wrote about quite provocatively moral enhancement. I think he focused mostly on biomedical moral enhancement. I haven't really seen what he's written more recently, but it would be interesting if his arguments could be applied to, using AI to help us be more moral. And more able or more morally capable in ways that alone we aren't. And this could be about could be in the form of getting AI to help prompt us to become more compassionate people. Be a sort of a compassionate life coach to help us reach greater potentials. So yeah, I think that's interesting. And you did mention, you did sort of say something, I think that might have sort of approached that argument. But yeah, what are your thoughts on AI as a potential moral enhancer for humans?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can. That's the thing, right? With AI and empowering technologies in general, that they can increase our capabilities in fairly broad ways, right? Including for helpful purposes. Unfortunately, also for harmful purposes. And yeah, I do see AI as having a lot of upside there, which of course then also needs to be, if we're talking about sort of broad level evaluations of AI and at policy levels and so on, it all needs to then also be held up against the potential for harm that people might be willing to use it for.
Mm.
But yeah, certainly, I think for those dedicated to reducing suffering, it can be potentially a very useful tool. And actually, like in my own book writing, it's also to give just one example, it's helped me a lot with finding relevant literature actually
Mm-hmm.
to look
Oh yeah,
into. Yeah, so
yeah, yeah.
and actually, I also wanted to say that I think when it comes to moral enhancement, I think that's actually something that's worth conceiving of, like in quite broadly, in the
Mm-hmm.
sense also that I think, although it's an old school form of moral enhancement, right? But even something as simple as a book can also be a form of genuine moral enhancement,
Yeah, I
and
agree.
perhaps in some cases it might be, I don't know. It might be more useful in some ways than some biochemical intervention. I mean, of course, it's complicated, right? But the thing with ideas, to phrase it even more broadly, is that they can often be more um, maybe specific in terms of how they're targeted, whereas biochemical interventions, it can be really, really difficult to make them super targeted, right? Because usually what you might increase certain dispositions, right? Certain inclinations, maybe boost certain sentiments and motivations, which I think can be really helpful. But it's often in a way where you sort of push maybe things in a sort of in a rather broad way, maybe kind of crude way. Um, and I do think that when it comes to, yeah, like ideas and culture, I think we should not underestimate, right, the degree to which that really is an area where we have a lot of, there are a lot of degrees of freedom there, and also like a whole lot of precision actually that's difficult to achieve with biochemical interventions or the like. And I think, I mean, probably ideally we would want to optimize across all these domains, but I guess in the near term it does seem like, I don't know, the domain of ideas might be where to focus the most. I would suspect, but I mean, I would be happy to be yeah, proven wrong, and to see some a pill that made people a lot more compassionate. I would welcome that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So would I. Whether people would want to take the pill is another question. Um, yeah. I mean, and if it was a reliable moral enhancer, should it be a choice if people take it, or should it just be put in the water supply? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, probably it's probably. I mean, actually, it is difficult to imagine what would be, what a reliable enhancer of that kind could even be, right? I mean, okay, maybe something. I think it's maybe easiest to think of something that could maybe ameliorate some kind of extreme condition, right? If we're talking about reducing extreme traits of sadism or psychopathy, right? I think that's a case where it seems relatively, yeah, uncontroversial, right? That would be an improvement. But beyond that, it is, um, yeah, but again, because of how, I mean, a very good example, right, from the empirical literature is that there was this, that oxytocin was hailed
Mm.
as this, what was it sometimes called maybe the love drug or the empathy hormone or so. But then it turns out, actually not so surprisingly, given human evolutionary history, that it seemed to have um, a strong in-group favoritism associated with it, and it didn't work as well apparently when it came to outgroups. It might even increase outgroup hostility. So maybe it's perhaps more a bit like I don't know, a catalyst maybe for more of like a tribal empathy and tribal binding or the like. And that is it's a great example of the kinds of complications that we can run into, right, with
Mm.
enhancements in this domain. Also because in some sense it would be surprising if there were some kind of simple dial that would make us say have more, yeah, be more effective at reducing suffering, given that just
Yeah,
so many components are involved, right?
right. I guess, like, if AI could help us improve our reasoning capacities with regard to moral problems, that would be good. But I mean, just increasing our reasoning capacities could also increase our capacity to reason how to do bad stuff more effectively. So,
Yeah, exactly.
but yeah, I don't know. It depends on whether you believe that increased reasoning capacity um, increases the likelihood of convergence to moral takes or something like that. But I mean, the orthogonality thesis isn't a prediction, but it's a thesis that any level of intelligence could value basically anything. I'm not sure I agree with arguments that use that as reasons to not believe that. I think that there's some values that can't be scaffolded with the cognition afforded to a fish, because they can't really understand the kind of cooperative dynamics required to run a civilization, right? But humans might have that ability. Maybe an AI even more capable of understanding cooperative dynamics could, in essence, have more moral potential because of their ability to realize values that we can't really fit in our heads, or any measure of compression would lose important signal. So yeah, so I mean, like, the next question is the controversial one, and that is, do you think AI could become more moral than us, right? Do you think it's
Yeah, I
possible?
mean, to be, yeah, I mean, that's almost a bit trivial. I mean, so first of all, um, I would admit that I don't think the bar is generally so high, unfortunately.
Yes,
Um,
me too.
and even including all of us, sadly. But so yeah, I think there is certainly potential there to for other systems in general, right? To become more moral than humans are. But of course, with that being said, they also have the potential to become much worse, like a
Yeah,
moral
yeah,
monster
yeah,
of a
absolutely.
scale that and kind that we can not even conceive of,
Mm.
which is yeah like a risk that's worth taking seriously, like this like extreme
Yeah,
variance in potential.
yeah. You mentioned the suffering risks in your book. AI sort of exacerbating, suffering throughout the universe, either on purpose or as a side effect of just doing whatever it's doing, for sure. So, do you think that, like, would you prefer a super intelligence that was aligned to human preferences, if you had to choose between human preferences or compassionate purpose? What would you?
Well, yeah. Um, so I mean, obviously, it's worth. I might I, I I might want to point out that compassionate purpose is obviously a subset, a prominent subset, I might add, of human preferences, right?
But
Well,
they might not
actually,
be uniquely human.
yeah, okay, yeah, that's also interesting, right? Um, but I would say actually, just as a brief bit of historical background, that it is interesting to notice how, and in fact, when I wrote this book, I in some sense, deepened my knowledge of this, the extent to which the reduction of suffering has been so strongly shared, for example, in Buddhism, especially in Mahayana Buddhism, with this focus on reducing the suffering of other beings. So, in that sense, it actually is a fairly strong current among like in in human values, also historically. And in fact, the book, in some ways, the book that comes the closest to compassionate purpose is a book that's written around the year 700, titled The Way of the Bodhisattva by
Mm.
Shantideva, a Buddhist monk. Um, yeah, a very inspiring book to me. That's full of like very a very strong commitment to compassion throughout this book that I find very inspiring. Of course, with very different metaphysics, very different kind of ontological views, but yeah, nonetheless, the commitment is very similar. But with that being said, I mean, with human preferences, obviously there are different levels at which one can ask this kind of question, right? Obviously, yeah, in the ideal, I would like to see this uh, universally benevolent superintelligence help us relieve the suffering of all beings, right? And bring ease and relief to all beings. But then, I mean, at another level, right, one can also then ask, what's a sensible way forward in the real world, given
Mm-hmm.
also various constraints, and what's a reasonable procedure, also given our own limitations of perspective and so on. And I do think there is something to be said in favor of, I mean, even if I can't specify much in detail, I think there is something to be said in favor of like, um, yeah, democratic ideals also, in terms of how we actually, move forward in the real world.
Mm.
So what would I actually favor in practice? Yeah, I would favor, well, first of all, which is very much in the spirit of democracy, right? With that, we actually have more of a discussion and debate about these things. A debate that's, yeah, more informed, both at the level of moral discussion and also at the empirical level, such as, I mean, including, if like having more informed views on likely future uh, capabilities of AI systems, and also like likely trajectories, given that
Mm.
we continue the way we currently are. So yeah, what I would favor, like at a more sort of down to earth level, is that we have more of a discussion of these critical issues, and that we also generally just, yeah, we make it much more of a priority actually to steer the future in a better direction, and that we do so based on more carefully and well considered values. Yeah, would be my plea.
Yeah, yeah. Like I do have sympathy for democracy and pluralism as well. I don't think we can be completely certain about our values. I think we all need a healthy dose of humility, and and we shouldn't create AI to just maximize a particular one value, right, that we think is the best thing, because that value at scale may turn out to be not what we might expect. Yep. So I agree. I guess the problem I have with democracy and pluralism, it's not everybody's informed. And democracy, the outcomes of democracy can hinge on, you know, how, I guess, Overton windows, persuasive arguments, um, you know, uh, just geopolitics that sort of people who are more sensitive to what's going on directly around them than what's going on globally and that sort of thing. So I worry that the people voting aren't necessarily the most well informed, or that they're animated by parochial concerns rather than, you know, more more concern for the well-being of other species, other people on the other side of the world. And but yeah, I mean, what's the solution? I don't know. And pluralism in itself, usually when there's disagreements among people's values, it it seems difficult to sort of solve those disagreements just with more pluralism. There has to be some principled way to adjudicate how to solve clashes of agreement, right? And it can't just be the most votes wins every single time. You know, there still needs to be focus on important matters that didn't receive that much public attention at the time, just weren't in the, you know, the Overton window, that people didn't vote for some sort of nuance of you know, news cycles around that particular time of the voting period. Like, you know, Brexit may have turned out differently if the news feeds were different, or if the weather was different. The Battle of Waterloo may have turned out differently if it didn't rain, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
there's all sorts of weird stuff that you know, either random or you know, whether there's just a whole lot of sort of selfish interests feeding the public square with biased information or misinformation, which can sway elections. So.
Yeah, I mean, I strongly agree. Like it's a very imperfect system, right? And a lot of contingencies and biases can influence it, yeah, in undue ways. But as you're saying, it's arguably like the best we have, right? It's not,
Mhm.
unfortunately, and it's even beyond, like, could you say, democracy at a formal level, right? It's also our public discourse is very imperfect, right? Also suffering from all these, yeah, having all these flaws and pitfalls, but it still seems like more or less what we have, right? To converse with each other and try to make some sense and find some kind of common direction or some kind of compromise that we can, yeah, um, hopefully find solutions that are at least partially win-win. Um, that yeah, I'm afraid I don't see much of an alternative to that.
Well, you mentioned in your, like, in chapter 8, when you, I think it's the takes a candid view of the human mind. One of the bluntest parts of the book, you argue that we are not unified moral agents, but minds made of many competing parts, even in our own minds, let alone disagreements with other people. So yeah, we've got hidden motives. We've got, you know, when someone says, "I just want to help sentient beings," that might statement might be hiding something like, "I want to become a moral superstar," you know, or something like that. So, what's the importance of all this? Do you think?
Yeah, yeah. I actually think it's hugely important because we can often be not just a little bit self-deceived, but like massively self-deceived about what's going on in our own minds and what we in some sense are trying to achieve, right? Because um, yeah, there are these, obviously there are different things one can try to optimize for in the moral domain, including yeah, including a kind of moral self-promotion, right? And increasing our own social status, that is the esteem we have in other people's assessments of us. And I think that's an area where it is, it's maybe an obvious statement, but very often we are actually more driven by that self promotion part. And an important qualification is that it doesn't have to be either or. It doesn't have to be that we're either sincere in our moral commitments or we are sincere in this kind of self-promotion project of increasing our status through, yeah, some kind of moral project. I think the truth about our minds is often more complicated, that we can actually have both these motives be real and genuine and strong at the same time, right? Which can then, and that's, I think, the big relevance of it at the end of the day is that if we are trying to reduce suffering as like one axis of I don't know, optimization, or like one core goal we have, then increasing our status will often not be aligned with that, right? There will often be trade-offs. I mean, arguably that's the default, right? That there will be trade-offs between uh, reducing suffering versus increasing our own social status, right? And doing what's more popular, right? Um, and so in that way, we can very easily end up being distorted, right? More pursuing the latter, more pursuing our own status, and that's the devious thing, right? While being quite unaware of this, right? Oh, I just happen to do this very flattering thing because, well, isn't that I imagine that's kind of helpful, right? Without necessarily deeply examining how that can be something that's maybe strongly motivated by how it can benefit our reputation, right? Something that we yeah can be strongly inclined to prioritize, even if we don't like to admit to that motive, right? That it's almost a bit like a spinning wheel or so in our minds that's generally driving in the background and sort of pushing us in a certain direction, even as we are, even as it's generally under the surface of conscious awareness, because it's so unflattering. And of course, I have been inspired here in this regard by the book The Elephant in the Brain by Kevin
Ah,
Simler and Robin
Robin
Hanson.
Hanson. Yeah, I
Yeah,
interviewed him on that actually,
yeah,
yeah, a
and
while ago.
I think they make great points on this issue, and not least when it comes to, yeah, like the actually the on how unconscious this can be, right? And so I think one can read The Elephant in the Brain while nevertheless still be quite unaware of these motives in ourselves, right? And the forms that these distortions can take, precisely because it's so close, and we almost like it's almost in some ways as though our minds are built to not see these aspects of
Mm.
ourselves, not see these drives and distortions, and then that's then at a later stage, right? Our where our capacity for motivated reasoning can come in, right? Namely to rationalize, to justify how what we are doing, to maybe primarily enhance our reputation. It might then be, we might give all sorts of rationalizations as to, oh, that's really the most effective way to reduce suffering, but that is um, it is quite suspicious that these aims would align in that way.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm worried about this idea that, sometimes when we think of ethics, I don't know, like, I think you talk about a single player hero mentality. Maybe that means that we think we're the only, there's this kind of solipsism to it where we think that we want to be the most effective player, and we want to be, the everybody else are kind of like cardboard cutouts, non-player characters. I'm not sure if
Yeah.
that's what you're getting at in the book, but what do you think about this sort of single player hero mentality, and why do you think that it might be harmful?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good example, right, of something that, if you have the reputation enhancement motive, right, this is arguably the perspective that you would predict, right? Like, here I am, and the hero in the quest,
Mm.
and others are these NPC cardboards, right? And I do think that actually that we are often very biased towards that kind of perspective, right? compared to, say, much more of a collective perspective where you might more see yourself as maybe like a node among
Mm.
other capable equals, right? And where from that perspective the goal maybe more becomes to be like, say, an effective enabler or so, right? And you maybe just try to marginally increase the effectiveness of the other nodes around you, right? But of course, that kind of enabling role, especially if it's behind the scenes, it doesn't come quite with the same prestige, right?
Mm.
Um, and one could also uh, maybe accuse me of being a hypocrite because here I am publishing books, right, and putting my name on them and so on, right, as opposed to maybe doing more valuable things behind the scenes. Who knows, right? Or the things that I'm not allowing myself to maybe even consider, because those would be, I don't know, unflattering prospects. I don't know. I'm just speculating out
Well,
loud,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, you could be doing other things. Who knows? You could be, I don't know. You could be the owner of a big Fortune 500 company, and doing Tony Robbins sort of business coach speeches around the world. Who knows? But yeah, you're not doing that. So look, I don't know whether it's a status motive that got you to do what you're doing, but I'm happy that you're doing what you're doing.
Well, thanks.
Mm.
But I think it is actually a key point, right? That it can really be difficult to see these things. I mean, obviously, I'm aware of, um, in fact, a whole list of considerations that led me to write these books, and also the two previous books I mentioned. But with that being said, right, it can be difficult to know, um, to be aware of like underlying motivational mechanisms that influence the way in which I evaluate these reasons I've outlined, right? And so, and I think maybe perhaps a good practice is to just yeah, maybe like admit ignorance about these kinds of things, that it just is quite limited. I'm not. I know Hansen. He has a very pessimistic view as to how much we can come to know about and maybe control for these kinds of tendencies. Um, I do think that we actually do have some potential to gain meaningful self-awareness and correct for it, like to an extent, because I mean, after all, it's not like it's some kind of supernatural super intelligence that's swirling around in our own minds, right, under the hood. But I do think it's a genuine challenge still, right, to become aware of these aspects, and not least how they can yeah, influences. And I think that, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I think that you've read Meditations on Moloch and all those sorts of things. So there seems to be it's not it's our own psychology, but I think maybe it was our psychology which caused us to end up with dynamics in our society, in our marketplace, in our politics that incentivizes this kind of like status seeking behavior. So, how do we build communities where these status incentives align better with actually reducing suffering?
Yeah, yeah. I think Robin Hansen, he's put that quite well. So he's often talked about how it isn't necessarily a problem that we're trying to impress an audience, right? That's not in itself it's the problem. As he argues, the problem is often that we're trying to maybe impress an audience that's not necessarily so well informed. Um,
Mm.
so, for example, if we are taking actions to reduce suffering or ostensibly reduce suffering, but that actually aren't so helpful, if if we are trying to um, impress a very informed audience, then at the end of the day, they're not going to be so impressed if what we're doing is something that's like overtly ineffective, right? So that's maybe a case for, well, there may be different levels at which we can um, yeah, like improve in this regard, right? So one way might be, perhaps a more realistic way might be to that we ourselves try to direct maybe even we can try to be more deliberate in trying to impress a more informed audience, like those who are maybe most informed within the, I don't know, a particular field. So yeah, that might mean, I don't know, so others who are also dedicated to reducing suffering, or yeah, working working on that. And in addition, or relatedly, yeah, there is then also like this broader task of creating informed communities, right? That can help actually create yeah, better incentives to where we sort of push each other in better directions in terms of what we reward with yeah, and I don't know, it's not maybe not a nice way to put it, but like what we reward with status, so to speak, right? If yeah, good work, or like other forms of compensation. Yeah, so and that I so this is also something that I know Kevin Simler, he's actually made that point as well, about that's the more ultimately maybe more realistic thing we can do, namely that we is his argument that we probably can't get around that humans are going to try to impress each other, and including with their work and their accomplishments. But then at least we can try to create, um, yeah, like better social incentives where what gets incentivized is something that is actually more beneficial at the end of the day.
I mean, like even rationalist cultures are vulnerable to its own version of tribalism,
Mm.
despite explicitly valuing truth seeking. Uh, so yeah, I like I'm not sure what the panacea to all this really is, but I do think that epistemic hygiene and apportioning beliefs to the evidence and all those sorts of things are really important. But yeah, I mean, it's a really strong motive that humans have is to seek status. Do you think it's more pronounced in men? I don't know.
Wow, yeah, that's
Probably.
I think, well, actually, there are some studies on this. In fact, where so what I can say is my understanding is there is some anthropological evidence suggesting that it is more pronounced in men, but at least, but then again, I think it might also be a case of it can take maybe different forms.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, in
Okay.
yeah, but no, but yeah, I also wanted to say, since you did mention, yeah, like the pitfalls that can still be there in communities even when they try to set up these incentives. I do actually, I think that we very much, even in the best case where a community does seek to um, like where one has a community that is well informed, and one seeks to reward more effective actions, I think even then it's still worth being highly skeptical of these kinds of status motives, because there is still I mean, first of all, there will most likely always be some divergence, right, between what actually gets rewarded and what's actually effective
Hmm.
for reducing suffering. I don't know. I mean, that can be just various, something like the halo effect, right? Might be just distorting even in the best case, um, and and similarly, I think it's just yeah, moment to moment. I think it's just much more productive if one can actually focus more neutrally on the question of what reduces suffering, as opposed to, I mean, it is a more indirect way, right? It's sort of how can I do some kind of moral thing that then gets me status, right? It does become sort of one step removed from the thing that ultimately should concern us. And I think, yeah, I do worry that that does it is difficult to see how it wouldn't still be a potential bias even when
Mm.
incentives are better. So for that reason,
Yeah.
I think an analogy might almost be a bit like I think I used that also in one essay, that it's a bit uh, like the One Ring, that it's so tempting, right? And one shouldn't we shouldn't imagine that we can necessarily control this thing, as opposed to having some kind of respect and concern that it might sort of take over and lead to in perverse ways, right? And distort our efforts.
Like coalition building, for instance, that's, in politics or in like just, community, you can imagine people initially wanting to do the right thing and then getting attracted to their, to the status seeking and coalition building, in order to gain power. In the back of their mind, they're always saying, as long as I get the next stage of power and then next, I'll be able to focus more attention on doing the good thing. And it'll have more of a, I guess, more of a lever to pull. Like the fulcrum will be like in a more opportune position, such that I'll have more of a, a leverage on how I enact good in the world. But
Yeah, and I think
these can be like, basically illusions that, we can always seeking more power, almost always seeking more status, that we actually forget to do the good thing. Or,
yeah,
we do the good thing that is biased or shaped in the way that our attention seeking or coalition building biases, yeah, shape it.
I think it is a great point when when you mention also like coalition building and our coalitional psychology, because that's actually another one that can be right apart from like individual impressiveness, like trying to signal that there's also like wanting to this strong drive to gain more power and influence for one's own coalitions. I think that's something that, yeah, it can often be helpful, but at the same time, I think we also plausibly have a bias towards overstating the importance of that and how convergent that is with actually reducing suffering. Just because it's quite deep in us, this kind of coalitional psychology, and again, yeah, it is nuanced because they can, especially if you have a coalition that's focused on reducing suffering, it becomes obviously more plausible that that's something that actually is helpful for reducing suffering. But even with that being said, there are actually also other ways that one can seek to reduce suffering, such as, for example, um, seeking to create more efficient compromises, right? More gainful compromises with also with those who don't necessarily strongly share our goals or values.
Mm.
And I think there can we can
Reduce
also
the
have these
polarization.
and so I think our coalitional psychology can also lead to these kinds of biases of greatly understating the value of compromises and and these kinds of things where it can become very all or nothing unfortunately in how
Hmm.
we approach things.
Well, how would you guard against that then? What useful practices for, sort of, avoiding these kinds of effects? I mean, yeah, especially in the current political climate, right?
Yeah, I mean, so I think one thing that can be pretty powerful, and also something that Brian Tomasic, he has spent a good deal of time writing essays about this, just with highlighting the benefits of compromise and cooperation, and trying to find win-win solutions when possible. So and in some ways, actually, win-win is often not so intuitive for us, right? So
Hmm.
because we can often be very zero-sum in how we approach things, and of course many games are zero-sum, but then also many aren't. And I think it can be valuable to actually highlight the possibility of win-win, even if it doesn't, it may not often feel right to pursue that, right? But that it actually can be beneficial. So it's a case where I suspect the recent argument can actually play a helpful role, while maybe also becoming more aware of our own plausible inclination toward being, yeah, tribal and coalitional in our outlooks, even to an excessive extent.
Hmm. Um, yes. So, what about cause prioritization? How would you frame compassionate purpose as a way to motivate the right kinds of causes? Do you think do you think do you think this could be a cause? Do you think like altruistic self help focus on compassionate purpose could be a legitimate cause to focus on, or is it more of like
That's
a
interesting.
personal thing?
So I think there are actually people who are trying to make it a cause. So I think in the EA movement, I don't know what the current status of this is, but there was at one point something called effective self-help. And then
Mm.
there's a group called Rethink Wellbeing, I think is the name, where they also offer actually therapy, like I think over 8 or 10 weeks. So it is, in some sense, yeah, it is like an existing current, one could say, within effective altruism. Um, to what extent it's a cause? I mean, maybe I mean, to some extent, given that I wrote the book, also I did think that it was something that deserved more attention. But I mean, when it comes to suffering reduction, it's tricky, right? Because there are so many areas that are highly neglected. I would also say, for example, yeah, maybe at this stage, politics is maybe probably still even more neglected in some sense, although it's extremely difficult comparison to make. But yeah, there are many neglected areas. So uh, is it an area that deserves some priority? I do think so, but then it will also obviously depend a lot from person to person, because if someone is already, yeah, doing quite well in their personal lives, there might be it might be relatively limited what one could gain from further investments, right, compared to focusing on other areas, right? Whereas some people
Mhm.
might be, it might be just the main thing to invest in first of all. But yeah, I mean, ideally, I would like to see that we had like more and better, more supportive infrastructure of this kind.
Yeah. Look, I don't know if it's appropriate to mention this, but I will. There's been a couple of people one of who I knew reasonably well, one of whom I was, I think, acquainted with suicides, basically, within the EA movement. Um,
Mm.
People have decided to take their own life. Uh, and look, I can't know what was really going on in their mind or what the real motives were for doing so. But I can't help but think if there was something, maybe if they had thought things through, maybe if they had have come into contact with some of the stuff that you have and, the stuff that you've been writing about, that may have helped uh, help them make a more informed decision about such, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's an extremely heavy and serious topic, that's for sure. And yeah, and honestly, it can be very difficult to talk about it in the way that does justice to it. Also, given that yeah, it's a very complicated issue, right? Also, if one thinks that, I mean, so to explain a bit of my own view of it, so I do actually think that people should have the right to end their own lives. But with that being said, I also think that actually that can be maybe even like surprisingly strong moral reasons to preserve one's life, and yeah, indeed take good care of oneself and prioritize personal safety. I even also have a section on that in the book. I think it does merit priority, and in some ways that point I think is something that can even maybe turn the intuitive associations that people have with suffering focused ethics on the head a bit, because one might think that, okay, if you prioritize suffering, then I don't know, continued existence is not important. But I would actually argue that it's extremely important, right? Considering, for example, one's potential to reduce suffering, which I'm not saying is the obviously the only reason one could have to preserve one's existence, but it's a, a very significant one, right? And also, it's worth, when it comes to something like ending one's life, like unfortunately, right, tragically, when it happens, it often does happen in a state of like a momentary state of overwhelm or feeling that things are difficult, um, which I guess can be generally agreed is not an optimal state from which to make such a major decision from, right? So and that I think is a very good reason to have um, strong support systems in place, right? Whether that means having crisis lines available for people, and just generally having resources that can, at the very least, help people get out of a, a state like that, and to get into more you say a more balanced state. But I can also say, disclose honestly, that I have been I've seen I know of events like this, if that's the right word, or stories like this, and of course been very touched by it, and that has also in fact reinforced my view of the need for having more resources for this and more focus on it.
Mm-hmm. Mm. So, in terms of what kind of causes this book motivates, when someone accepts that extreme suffering matters, um, what should they actually do next? I mean, so we've covered self-help, the aspect of it, and assuming that one's at a place where they're ready to sort of, do something good in the world, or add more to what they can do good in the world. What does what kind of actions do you think your book would motivate in terms of how people would choose causes to follow?
Yeah, so I do have a full chapter on that, actions we can take to reduce suffering, where I do actually divide it into different broad cause areas, which are framed very broadly, with the first being to reduce human suffering, where there are various actions we can take, and the organization OPIS, Organization for the Prevention of Intense Suffering, they have pursued various interventions, like one that's gained some traction in the year movement is trying to reduce and prevent cluster headaches. It's a very intense form of pain, and it seems that there is growing evidence that various psychedelics can actually help prevent them, such as psilocybin and LSD and DMT apparently. So that's one cause area that some people in the suffering focused movement are prioritizing, or set of interventions depending on how one views it. And then another broad cause area is then to reduce the suffering of non-human animals, which includes both the suffering of farmed animals and also the suffering of wild animals, who may suffer both due to human intervention, but also due to natural causes such as disease and starvation. So those are obviously very broad areas. A lot of people in the effective altruism movement are focusing on those areas, and like which may include like trying to move humanity away from various forms of exploitation of other
Mm.
animals. It can include, for example, like one focus area could be preventive bans, such as trying to prevent octopus farming from becoming a major thing, which is something that apparently
Mm.
is growing and or maybe could become a big thing, and perhaps the right kinds of I don't know, strategies and moves might prevent that from materializing, which could potentially be a major win. And the same applies to also insect farming, which already exists and might grow a lot, and that might also be, I mean, that can be especially concerning considering both the number of insects involved in insect farming and also the ways in which they are often killed without any concern for potential pain at all. So like they might just be boiled alive or roasted alive and the like.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, obviously those are areas where there's just enormous room for improvement. There's so much to be done, and my impression is also that it's actually still, unfortunately, quite resource poor. This
Mm-hmm.
broad cause area of reducing the suffering of non-human animals, and it's also a cause area that looks very good if one is focusing on like near-term suffering, right? Given the just the scale of it. So if we're talking about ongoing suffering, the suffering of non-human animals is by far like the suffering that occurs on the largest scale on Earth. And well, moving beyond that, there's then reducing S risks or risks of astronomical future suffering, which is also a strong focus of the Center for Reducing Suffering, where I work. And that's another broad cause area. It of course is different in that it is more about, it's about future suffering. It's about a risk of something that doesn't currently exist, and in that way it is also more by nature a lot more speculative. Both the risk itself and the various interventions that we might pursue, it's much more difficult to achieve to gain a substantial level of confidence or robustness. But nevertheless, there are people who try to work on this, and there have been various approaches have been proposed, such as trying to reduce broad risk factors or plausible risk factors for S risks, which might include there's work on ideological fanaticism by David Althaus, and published recently on the EA forum. There's also, in fact, also by David Althaus and my colleague Tobias Baumann, work on preventing malevolent actors from coming into power. So people with sadism and psychopathy, preventing them from taking over, and which is often a risk in authoritarian states, which relates to authoritarianism as also being a potential risk factor for S risks. And these are, all of them are quite broad areas where one can pursue interventions to try to reduce these risk factors. Beyond these broad risk factors, there's then also AI has been a very prominent focus when it comes to S risk reduction, and the organization Center on Long-Term Risk has done work on this for a long time. They are focusing on, I believe, both cooperative AI, like preventing AI systems from ending up in harmful conflicts, and also I think they also have work that's focused on the improving the traits of AI systems, so preventing AI systems from becoming spiteful or sadistic, and
Hmm.
which could potentially also cause a lot of suffering. So yeah, that's AI has been a very prominent focus in among those seeking to reduce S risks. So that's yeah, and I do recommend that people interested in that can look into, for example, the work done by Center on Long-Term Risk, and to some extent also at CRS, or the Center for Reducing Suffering, where I work, where my colleague Tobias Baumann has also written about yeah, reducing S risks from AI. And beyond that, then there's like more like a broader cause area that one might call like broad capacity building, which
Hmm.
could consist in like increasing the priority that we generally devote to the reduction of suffering. It could mean like increasing the movement of people who are
Hmm.
devoted to this cause, a broader aim,
Hmm.
and likewise also just increasing the level of competence that this movement has, or indeed society has, when it comes to reducing suffering. So, and that can also take many different forms. So, like for example, contributing to, it might mean, yeah, improving what we know about cooperation, how to promote cooperation.
Hmm.
It might also be studying, for example, moral psychology and the psychology of compassion. So I think that's also, it can be like a broad yeah, there are various broad capacity building efforts that one can pursue that may also be helpful. So yeah, I think those are some like four broad cause areas that I would emphasize, and then one can, I think it can be helpful to frame um, yeah, to frame things in terms of these different cause areas, and to then try to make it can be helpful to make comparisons between them, and to then zoom further in on specific interventions that one can pursue within these cause areas. And I also want to emphasize that cause areas need not be mutually exclusive. So like for example, this the last one I mentioned with broad capacity building, that can potentially benefit, well, the previous cause areas I mentioned by, yeah, for example, increasing the resources that are available, and the number of people who are willing to, yeah, to work on these areas.
Yeah, yeah, and that feeds back into this, you know, avoiding status seeking, more like becoming a node that helps other, activates other nodes in a big network of that cumulatively increase the overall effectiveness. Yeah, yeah, I like the way you put that. It was really cool. I really also like the idea of getting more of the science done on how compassion works. I think that's a really interesting project. I'd like to know. I'd like to there to be a Manhattan project on sentience. If we could measure to some degree the capacity, at least the neural correlates and the biological correlates of felt experience, then we could have more empirical grounds on which to base arguments in the courtroom around the effects of animal farming and like factory farming and things like that. I think that could be not only just a persuasive argument for the everyday person to get involved with. Okay, well, now that I know that there's a certain amount of suffering, or at least I'm highly confident because I can see not only the animal's behavior, but there's operational evidence within the biology of the organism to suggest that they're experiencing certain things under certain conditions, suffering, for instance. But in a courtroom, I mean, this kind of evidence may may hold a lot more sway than some of the types of evidence we currently have. So yeah.
Right, yeah.
Mm,
I guess I have two thoughts on that. So one thought is that, first of all, I think there is actually a lot of compelling evidence of this kind, right? When we
I
look
think there
at
is.
like the neuroscience, and even like the genetics, like underlying yeah, the biology of pain and suffering. But then secondly, unfortunately, this kind of knowledge, I agree that there's a lot of upside to it, but at the same time, it can also potentially be very dangerous knowledge if it
Mm,
could, um, yeah, potentially, in terms of what it could, what people could do with it, right? If it ends up in the wrong hands. So that's not necessarily a knockdown argument against pursuing
mm,
it, but it may be a reason to that one might actually want to treat this field of study maybe in similar ways to how we treat the um, research on pathogens or the like, right? That it's something that needs to be some kind of, I don't know, maybe just a lot of care around it, and in terms of what's and even, and this is also very practically relevant when it comes to, for example, um, where, yeah, I grant again that this knowledge can be useful, but for example, there are currently computer systems being built. I believe it's called CL1, for example, where they're using human neurons to build computers, functional computers, and even apparently building data centers now with that will use these kinds of yeah, human neuron based computers.
mm.
And I mean, and I think we should take very seriously the risk, right? Even without claiming, oh, there's definitely suffering going on. Obviously, that's not a claim that we can confidently make, right? But there is a strong case for prudence here, I think, and caution when it comes to the risks of what might be involved in some brain tissue, right? And yeah, and I think generally both there are serious risks that both in research and in industry, we could end up creating systems that can suffer, and it seems quite critical that we have some kind of, yeah, responsible regulation, and somehow some institutions in place that prevent that, and not only prevent it but also instantiate some a reasonable level of concern for the risks around it.
That being said, yeah, that's fascinating. It does bring up the question of what sort of things we should avoid doing. What should people avoid sort of researching or doing, even if they think that it's morally urgent? Like, like I think that it's morally urgent to know whether these brain cells suffer in a data center, but maybe the dual nature of this knowing this understanding that they suffer might be used against people. So it's look, I mean, that's an example, but is there any other examples of things that you think people should avoid doing, if even if they think it's morally urgent?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, there are some like very obvious examples, right? One can point to where, for example, and I think um, it can be tempting, right? If one sees some instances of ongoing suffering, to maybe pursue some kind of radical action that, yeah, perhaps seems beneficial from a very narrow perspective, right? Where you try to address that particular issue right in front of you, right? But one can thereby risk losing sight of this much bigger picture, right? This bigger background reality that any specific instance of suffering, right, exists within a much larger context. And I do think that it's extremely important to, yeah, to consider like the backfire risks that a given action can potentially have. And I think that gives us reason to generally be, I mean, it's a tricky balance, right? Because I do
Mm.
think there can be a place for some forms of radical action, but always with an emphasis on it being peaceful, and also being, yeah, to the extent possible, right? That we ideally we want to also invite people to have a discussion about some larger issue or issues, rather than turning people off with some actions that, yeah, might seem justified from with a very narrow lens, but like on closer consideration or deeper consideration, also considering where people actually are, right? Where where are most people at, and how will most people see this given action, right? Because they might not share a perspective on something, right, being a moral atrocity, say, right? And so that's a pragmatic reality that we have to, or yeah, uh, uh, practical reality that we have to be pragmatic in addressing. And so that's like a general rule of thumb, I would say, is to keep in mind this bigger picture, and to generally, yeah, connect our efforts with that, right, and these larger effects, which can, I mean, I don't want to say again that it rules out radical action, but it generally does, maybe at least directionally serve as somewhat of more of an update towards modesty and towards more like capacity building in a way that ideally is broad and inclusive and inviting, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. Yes, modesty and humility, you know, sometimes we're just, as humans, we can be overconfident about things. We can believe that, our course of action is the most important thing in the world, and we get excited and enthusiastic, and we may lose sight of the bigger picture. But, you know, given uncertainty, we should afford some level of default, at every moment, some form of humility and modesty about how likely we are to be accurate in our estimations at the time. Like, if someone's considering extremist action against, a company that they don't like, and do something that they might regret later, or that a lot of people will regret them doing later. That could be a disaster. So I mean, this does bring up the idea of, like, how do we approach, if we, like I said, we need humility, but if we're humble, we know that there's a lot of uncertainty out there. How do we approach cause prioritization with the degree of humility that we need, and the amount of uncertainty that there is really out there to contend with?
Yeah, I think that's a super difficult question. I do think it's difficult to, even within our own minds, representationally, do justice to the amount of uncertainty we face, right? And the sheer complexity of what one is trying to do. Like, it's almost impossible to faithfully represent that. Um, but then, of course, with that being said, yeah, we also want to keep in mind that there is real ongoing suffering, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not as though that, for example, inaction itself is privileged, right? That also has its own set of risks, and can also be, what can you say? Yeah, end up making things much worse compared to the alternative, right? Um, so that's a key thing to keep in mind, I think. And then yeah, I mean, I do think keeping caution and humility in mind is generally quite helpful, right? When trying to sort out one's priorities, while then at the same time also um, seeking to take sensible, beneficial steps that reduce and prevent suffering. um, yeah, I don't think there really is, unfortunately, like a simple or super satisfying answer to this kind of question, right? I mean, and there are many people who are like grappling a lot with essentially this question. One thing that is perhaps worth emphasizing is that I think when we are very uncertain, that at least generally speaking, that can be something that favors an approach where we um, yeah, like increase our capacities and don't lock ourselves in, don't go all in on some particular action, partly because we might learn more over time, and that learning might give us reason to, yeah, to change what we focus on and prioritize. So for that reason, it does, I think, make sense to build up like various forms of flexible capacity, that can then be like reoriented and used as yeah, as we hopefully learn more over time.
So there's the issue of cluelessness as well, and I don't know if like you'd answer this issue in the same way as you'd answer, high degrees of uncertainty. But how should we handle cluelessness? The fear that our actions may have unforeseen or bad consequences. I mean, yeah, I, do you fall somewhere in between extreme uh, precaution? And Max Moore, who is a famous transhumanist, argues for proaction. What do
Proaction.
you think? How to handle cluelessness?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I guess there are also two things to separate. One is like backfire risks, right? Which one can endorse even without endorsing cluelessness, which is, I think, so. And cluelessness itself, I guess one can have different kinds of views, right? It can be more or less strong. Maybe one could hold that we are currently clueless, but not necessarily bound to be clueless. So one could also hold the stronger view that we are even bound to be clueless. We can never escape a state of being completely clueless about how to, for example, best reduce suffering. But and obviously backfire risks, concern about backfire risks can be a reason one might end up with a position of cluelessness. But my own view, and I mean, obviously, cluelessness can be quite paralyzing, right? Because yeah, one might end up having no practical direction at all if one endorses cluelessness, and if one, which is then a separate step, actually endorses some kind of consequentialist view according to which our expectations about, say, future suffering are what should be uniquely determine our actions, right? Which, of course, one can have a suffering focused view without necessarily agreeing with that kind of consequentialist view in particular. So, but, anyways, those are some various clarifications to get out of the way. My own view, I mean, I don't endorse cluelessness, but then I'm very sympathetic towards it. And I do, and have for a very long time, endorsed like we do have enormous amounts of uncertainty, right? That 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 much seems certain, we can say. Uh, but and then as for how to address it, I mean, I do actually. I'm not sure if one were completely clueless, whether one could then, from that basis alone, um, that wouldn't necessarily endorse a very cautious approach over any other, given that if one is completely clueless. But I do actually tend to uh, endorse a fairly cautious approach of, um, yeah, as I just mentioned, this strategy of gradually increasing flexible capacity does seem like a sensible strategy to me, while also being, yeah, which is perhaps somewhat implied by the gradual aspect, while being quite cautious and aware of, yeah, various kinds of backfire risks. That is also something that I think can, maybe to a somewhat counterintuitive extent, can also recommend prioritizing more learning, actually,
Hmm.
which of course one can
Hmm.
see as a form of capacity building. But yeah, learning more um, potentially relevant insights about how we can reduce suffering. So yeah, I would broadly favor that. I mean, it's a very incomplete and brief answer, but I think that's at least part of the answer for me.
Hmm. Let me ask this: have you had any objections to the world building you did with compassionate purpose? Do you think, yeah, is there any strong objections you've encountered uh, to the
You
writing?
mean, so here are you thinking of Compassionate Purpose, that book in
Yeah,
particular?
just a compassionate purpose book. I mean, like I don't, because it's only just came out. I don't know if anybody's given you a strong pushback or anything, or one of your um, somebody who proofread your stuff, or somebody you asked for some red teaming. Yeah.
Well, Mm, this, let's see. I mean, this might, um, perhaps the following suggests that I haven't shared it widely enough, but actually so far the feedback I got was, I think, pretty much uniformly supportive. Um,
Great.
yeah, as far as I remember.
So far,
I mean,
yeah.
in fact, at the very early stages, I did try to be strongly critical of the project myself. So I did write up a document with various considerations, both for and against pursuing this project. And in fact, I had, yeah, maybe the strongest doubts I've seen have been my own
Hmm.
about the project.
Mm.
Like, just one reason being the opportunity costs, and maybe also the fact that at the very early stages, not so much later, but at the very early stages, I was very excited about the project, which
Mm.
for me was also a bit suspicious. Like, is it just, am I just excited about this? Is that the reason I'm I feel inclined to pursue it? But then, fortunately, later on, the excitement faded, so that couldn't be the reason anymore.
Mhm, 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 mhm. Oh,
But yeah,
that's
no, I
good.
haven't. I found, yeah, people to generally be fairly supportive of the project, and like the people do seem to have found that it's that it is like a real gap. There is a real gap there that seem in need of yeah, being addressed.
Yeah, so there's nothing really unique to this book. You've probably heard, like, faced criticisms that you've focused too much on suffering and not enough on well-being. But they're sort of, these are things, these are criticisms we've all heard before. Is there any other concerns that it against the general project of suffering focused ethics, other than you don't focus enough on well-being, that you think is important?
I mean, maybe as a general, like a general clarification, and an important point to highlight is that yeah, that suffering focused views can still be quite can still be pluralist, right? So, for
Okay.
example,
Yep.
one can prioritize the reduction of suffering while also uh, giving importance to other things, such as like it might be, say, reducing preference frustrations, or injustice, for example, or violations of autonomy or rights violations. So many people have, quite a number of those who endorse suffer-focused views have pluralist views of this kind, where they also consider, individual autonomy to be important, and something to protect. And I think it's worth stressing, right? Because it's not as though it's either, um, it's not as though a suffering-focused view then must necessarily be monist. And likewise, even if one thinks that suffering doesn't capture everything, that doesn't necessarily mean, for example, that one must endorse, say, a moral symmetry between suffering and, purported like positive pleasure or so. Um, so yeah, those are some, I think, relevant clarifications to make.
Hmm. Has anybody been alienated by the project because it's heavy focus on suffering, do you think? Um,
Oh,
mm,
yeah, compassionate purpose as that project.
yeah.
I mean, I can imagine it might be, because I am very explicit about it, even in the book description, right? That it's this larger purpose of reducing extreme suffering is the core aim I have there in the book. I can imagine that might be, and in fact, I would have reacted the same way. I think, like years back, that doesn't necessarily feel so inspiring or uplifting, right? It's not like I've heard, well, there was maybe some early feedback that was a little bit to this effect, but yeah, generally, yeah, I haven't heard much, but I would imagine that can be, yeah, that's some people would be turned off by that.
Let's just say someone like just disagrees with suffering focused ethics in general. Do you still think that they can still get stuff from the book? What would you hope that they still get from this book? Because I think that even if you don't believe, even if you don't have even if you're just a classical utilitarian or somebody who's not that concerned about reducing suffering, you can still use these principles to do good in the world. You know, I,
Yeah,
I,
yeah,
I
and of
yeah.
course, one can also be a classical utilitarian and obviously be feel very overwhelmed by the suffering of the world. So I think those tools for managing those kinds of challenges really are quite value neutral, I would say, right?
Mm,
Including when it comes to better handling one's own suffering. And of course, some of the things we've discussed about, say, yeah, the potentially distorting influence of status motives, right, is also something that is has quite broad relevance.
mm,
Yeah, and so does also these various cause areas and actions we can take to reduce suffering is also of relevance to a classical utilitarian, obviously. So yeah, I would say pretty much pretty much all of the books should still be relevant and to some extent useful.
do you think there's any open questions that are really important to cover when it comes to either suffering focused ethics or stuff that some of the more self care stuff you address in your book?
Right, so you mean like questions that like our current science hasn't explored so
Yeah,
much
yeah,
and be
yeah. That
yeah.
that 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 would be nice to answer, but we just don't have enough uh, data. We don't have enough, or we haven't really thought through it enough.
I mean, some of it is maybe a little bit maybe nerdy on my part, but like
Okay.
there are some studies. In fact, some of these are already pre-registered, but like I would like to see like even more studies comparing different kinds of therapeutic modalities and approaches head to head to see which
Mm-hmm.
ones are yeah do better in those kinds of. I mean, ultimately, it would be great to have yeah more. There are so many potential permutations, right, of different components that you could put together in a therapy approach or yeah, a general also a self help approach, right,
Mm-hmm.
for building resilience and the like. And yeah, it would just be very interesting to test different ones out, right, including I also mentioned this thing about self compassion and yeah, I think there are potentially, although this is would be very like elaborate, right, to study all these things, but I think over time we can hopefully find out more about which exact approaches are um, yeah most beneficial and for what purposes. I do think we already have pretty decent ideas about this, but yeah, it would still be great to learn more. And also, as I mentioned, the same applies to actually compassion. I would really like to know more about um, yeah, like when it comes to the motivational effects of empathy and compassion and what what mixes of these, as it were, are optimal for various purposes, right? Including like motivationally to act, um, to be more inclined to take action in the world, and also when it comes to yeah, us handling things better, being less overwhelmed, right? And it could even be that we might want to shift around a bit, or depending on how well we're doing, right? If we have, I don't know, say a bad period, it might be worth turning down the empathy to some extent compared to at other times where we can maybe better bear it. But anyways, I think there are still like tons of quite relevant questions and yeah nuances that are worth exploring further. In many cases, obviously, what I end up suggesting or recommending are like the what seems to have the best evidence supporting it. So it's sort of like an inference to maybe the best explanation or the best recommendation based on current evidence. But yeah, they can certainly be refined further. So in that way, I hope it's like just the first step in a project of yeah gaining better informed, like more refined recommendations.
Okay. What would you count as real progress real moral progress over the next few decades.
Yeah, I mean, so I think practically speaking, some things would be sort of very, very obvious moral progress, right? That we shut down factory farms, right? That's something that just shouldn't exist anymore. And I guess, yeah, there are even surveys, with most people um, at least expressing support for that. Um, so close to, and that was already back in 2017, we're close to 50%. And that was even replicated. Um, Close to 50% of the US population expressed uh, support, or at least, yeah, a meaningful level of support for closing down factory farms. I do think that is something that's worth placing very strong emphasis on. Other forms of moral progress, again, if we stay in the more practical domain, well, I do think it would be significant moral progress. Do we insist on calling it moral progress? I don't know, but actual, real practical progress would be to increase at the more institutional level, increase free speech and liberal democracy. Ideally, I do think that would be progress relative to, yeah, the current state in, yeah, specifically in authoritarian states. To increase that would be, uh, in my view, progress that, and a form of progress that in fact can facilitate further progress, right? Because it enables us to thereby, we can have freer, more open moral discussions if we in the first place have free speech, and we are free to criticize governments without fear of being thrown in jail or worse. So yeah, like at a practical level, that I would count as progress. And then of course also, it's maybe a bit vague, but I do think being just generally approaching technological development in much more responsible ways, taking seriously the, yeah, just how consequential technological development actually is, and yeah, trying to, as I mentioned earlier, like trying to also have more of an open and informed discussion about um, where the technology is and where it's heading, and also what we think ourselves in terms of our ideals and values, how we, yeah, we should steer technology to the extent that we can. Yeah, I do think, I mean, that's probably a conversation that will, by default, become more and more prominent. And well, I think progress would then also, it would constitute progress both that we have that discussion more, could you say, that it does become more prominent, and also that we have it in a more um, maybe deliberate way.
Just out of interest, what's your AIP Doom credence level?
Well,
What is it?
I guess it
Exactly.
depends on how do we define doom exactly.
Yeah.
If it's because, yeah, I find that the doom term can be a little bit vague, right? I mean, does it include some kind of I mean, so for example, some would consider a transhumanist future where there's maybe still some humans in control to be a doom scenario. And so it's just maybe a bit fussy, too fussy for
Mm.
me to quite say,
Say
without
it
like
just
a,
meant like just extinction of human life. Let's just say extinction, even more broadly, of life capable of sentient experience. And you know, all we ended up having was replicators creating paper clips or something like that. Uh,
well,
that
yeah,
kind of doom, extreme doom.
yeah, but even that, I find a very complicated question, given that because, so for example, one scenario that I could be unsure whether or not is included here is, we can imagine that all existing life forms, sentient life forms, went extinct, but then even if an initially non-sentient AI system
Yep.
is the one that, so to speak, takes over, it might nevertheless develop sentience, or it could also
Mm-hmm.
be sentient in the process. So in that sense, and I mean, you could even get a bit creative, and perhaps some human emulation scenarios would, on some people's views, be included here. So
Mm-hmm.
in that way, it's still a bit unclear. Like, yeah, which scenarios actually get included. And I don't just say that as a kind of I don't know, it's actually a relevant point for making these assessments, or for giving an estimate also, because uh, I myself have quite a lot of uncertainty when it comes to yeah, the probability of sentience in especially like future AI systems, right? It's
Yeah.
there's a lot of uncertainty there, and that uncertainty would then somehow be uh, need to be factored in, at least if it's not um, yeah, if we're not talking about existing kinds of sentient beings.
Mm.
And also obviously the time scale is important, right? Because if we're talking about, there's a big difference between PDoom within the next few decades then versus say a million years, or or the like, right? Where we could have a much more yeah, like a gradual evolution replacement scenario, which I do think is actually quite plausible. I mean, apart from some kind of political decision of preservation, right? It does seem to me quite plausible that things would yeah, eventually move towards another state. So in that sense, uh, the human being in its current form does not seem like a stable long-term equilibrium to me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But by the way,
Yep.
I unfortunately I have a meeting in 3 minutes coming up, so I'm
Okay.
afraid I have to run
All
now.
right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, this could go on forever. But yeah, thanks so much for doing this marathon interview discussion. I really appreciate your dedication to this cause. You've got a lot of
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, you've got a lot of energy. I guess the final thing is, yeah, I mean, if we had a wiser civilization 200 years from now, looking back at us, what do you think that they'd see as being our biggest successes, and what would they feel would be the most morally shocking? as a
yeah.
last question.
Most morally shocking. Yeah, I'll try to be very brief. So most morally
Mm,
shocking, I would again point to factory farming.
yeah.
Maybe okay, another contender would be the irresponsibility with which we are developing technology. That would be another one. And then I think the other question I would probably leave open ended, right? What they would be most impressed with or the like, I would say that that remains to be seen, I think.
Mm, mhm, mhm, mhm. Awesome. Well, it's really wonderful having you on the show again, Magnus, and I really appreciate that you've spent so much energy focusing on these kinds of things. So, look, where can people find your book? In plural. You've got your website, and yeah,
Yeah,
well,
my website is
we
the easiest, I think. So magnusvinding.com. And then also, I think, yeah, most of my books are also available for free on Amazon.
fantastic. All right. Well, thanks. Cheers. Been really wonderful speaking to you again, and I hope to get the opportunity to do it again. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope so too, Adam. Thanks so much for having me.
Cheers. Speak to you.
Take care.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Bye.